The massive oak doors of the cathedral exploded inward, raining shattered stained glass over the screaming elite. Through the blinding white smoke stepped Julian Thorne, the ruthless mafia boss the entire city believed was rotting at the bottom of a river. He was clad in black tactical gear, his assault rifle raised, his gray eyes burning with absolute, world-ending rage. At the altar, Senator Richard Vance dragged Clara backward, pressing the cold barrel of a silver revolver violently against her temple. Vance's face was slick with terrified sweat, his arrogant mask melting into pure panic. "Drop the gun, Thorne," Vance shrieked, his voice cracking hysterically as he choked Clara in his grip. "Drop it or I blow her brains out right here." Julian froze. The lethal, ice-cold king of the underworld stared at the woman he loved, his eyes widening with a desperate, paralyzing terror. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered his rifle. "Let her go, Richard," Julian rumbled, a deadly vibrating promise echoing through the ruined sanctuary. "And I will make your death quick," Vance sneered, his lips curling in a triumphant, sickening smile. "She's carrying my ring now." "You're too late." But Vance didn't look at Clara. He didn't see the absolute, obsidian fire ignite in her dark eyes. And he didn't see the lethal, medical-grade syringe she had just slipped from the hidden folds of her heavy silk wedding dress. She wasn't a helpless hostage waiting to be rescued. She was his executioner. How did a brilliant advocate end up carrying a mafia boss's child in secret, only to become the deadliest queen of his empire? Subscribe to our channel and dive into a story of absolute betrayal, equal partnership, and a love that burned the underworld to the ground. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of a double bass bled through the velvet-lined walls of the subterranean corridor, a heartbeat echoing in the dark. Clara Sterling stood in the shadows, the damp hem of her crimson evening gown clinging to her ankles, freezing against her skin. The rain outside had been torrential, a merciless deluge that matched the ruins of her life. But down here, beneath the glittering facade of the city's financial district, the air was suffocatingly warm, laced with the scent of aged bourbon, expensive cigars, and danger. She did not belong here. Clara was a woman of the daylight, an advocate, a builder of safe havens. For the past 5 years, her entire existence had been dedicated to the Sterling Women's Shelter, a fortress for the broken and the abused. She had spent her life pulling women out of the underworld's grip, not walking willingly into its jaws. But the shelter was gone. The memory of the flames still danced behind her eyes, a vicious, crackling nightmare that tasted of ash. She had arrived just in time to watch the roof collapse in a shower of sparks. Her stepmother, Evelyn, hadn't even bothered to hide her involvement. The text message had arrived on Clara's phone while the fire engines were still wailing in the distance. "You have a debt to pay. Clara, Senator Vance expects his bride by the end of the month. The shelter was a distraction. Now you have nowhere else to go." Evelyn thought she had crushed her. She believed that by destroying Clara's life's work, she would force Clara to surrender, to accept a forced marriage to Richard Vance, a sadistic, corrupt politician who viewed women as disposable commodities. They thought Clara would weep, pack her bags, and submit to the gilded cage. They did not know her at all. Clara adjusted her grip on the small, diamond-studded clutch in her hand. Inside rested a single, encrypted flash drive. It was Vance's insurance policy, stolen from his private safe during a charity gala 3 nights ago. Clara had intended to take it to the authorities, but the fire had illuminated a terrifying truth. The authorities belonged to Vance. The police, the judges, the system, they were all cogs in the machine that was currently trying to devour her. If she went to the law, she would be handed straight back to her stepmother, to fight monsters. One had to seek out the Leviathan. She stepped into the light of the main casino floor. The transition was blinding. Chandeliers dripped with crystal, casting a fractured, golden glow over the mahogany tables and plush roulette wheels. The elite of the city, corrupt bankers, politicians, and silent killers in tailored suits mingled in hushed tones. This was the sanctum, an illegal, invitation-only empire operated by the single most feared man in the state, Julian Thorne. Getting in had required calling in a debt of her own, 3 years ago. Clara had hidden a battered woman named Maria from a violent enforcer. Clara had secured Maria a new identity and a safe passage out of the country. Before leaving, Maria had whispered a password and a side entrance. A ghost door, used only by the inner circle of the Thorn Syndicate. If you ever need to disappear, Maria had said, the sanctum has doors the cops can't see. Clara hadn't come to disappear. She had come to declare war. She moved through the room with a deliberate, unhurried grace, her heart hammered wildly against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. But her face was an absolute mask of aristocratic calm. Men turned to look at her, predators all of them. They saw a beautiful, soaked woman in a red dress, a lamb wandering into the slaughterhouse. Let them think it. She bypassed the blackjack tables, ignoring the heavy gaze of a security guard who stepped forward, then hesitated. Clara walked with the entitled authority of someone who owned the room. A psychological trick she had learned from years of standing between abusers and their victims. She kept her eyes fixed on the elevated VIP alcove at the far end of the hall. The air grew perceptibly colder as she approached the alcove. Two massive men in charcoal suits moved to block the velvet rope, their hands casually resting over the bulges of their shoulder holsters. Private table, miss, the taller one said, his voice a gravelly rumble that left no room for argument. I have an appointment. Clara lied flawlessly, her voice smooth and chillingly even. Mr. Thorne doesn't take appointments. The guard replied, his eyes narrowing. He reached out to grip her arm. I'm going to have to ask you to touch me. Clara interrupted, her tone dropping to a lethal whisper. And you will be explaining to your boss why you delayed the delivery of Senator Vance's private ledgers, the ones currently sitting in my purse. The ones that name every judge on Thorne's payroll. The guard froze. The mention of the ledgers was a gamble, a massive, terrifying roll of the dice. Clara knew Julian Thorne and Richard Vance were engaged in a silent, bloodless turf war for control of the city's ports. She was betting her life that Thorne wanted those ledgers more than he wanted her thrown out into the rain. A tense silence stretched between them. Then, a voice cut through the ambient noise of the casino, a voice that was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of warmth. Let her pass, Marcus. The guard stepped aside instantly, like shadows retreating from a flame. Clara took a steadying breath and stepped beyond the velvet rope, walking into the dimly lit enclave. The man sitting alone at the high-stakes poker table was not what the urban legends had painted. The whispers called Julian Thorne a monster, a ruthless executioner who had clawed his way from the foster system to the throne of the underworld by leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. They said he was made of ice, a machine without a pulse. In person, the reality was far more arresting. Julian Thorne was impeccably dressed in a dark, bespoke suit with no tie, the collar of his crisp white shirt unbuttoned to reveal a sliver of scarred skin. His dark hair was neatly styled, but it was his eyes that stole the breath from Clara's lungs. They were a striking, piercing gray, holding the profound, weary depth of a man who had seen the absolute worst of humanity and had learned to outlast it. He sat with a relaxed, feline grace, shuffling a deck of playing cards with hypnotic precision. He didn't look up from the cards as she approached. It is generally considered poor form to blackmail my security detail, Miss Sterling, Clara said, stopping at the edge of the table. Clara Sterling. Julian's hands stilled. He finally looked up, his gray eyes locking onto hers. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on Clara's arms stand on end. He catalogued her in an instant: the wet hair, the ruined hem of the expensive gown, the defiance burning in her dark eyes, and the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her exhaustion. Evelyn Sterling's stepdaughter, Julian mused, his voice smooth velvet over broken glass. The bleeding heart who runs the shelter in the East End. I heard it burned down tonight. A tragic accident. They're calling it on the news. It was arson, ordered by Arthur Pendleton, executed by Evelyn's men, all to force me to honor a marriage contract to Senator Richard Vance, Clara stated, her voice devoid of self-pity. She placed the diamond clutch on the green felt of the poker table. I don't have time for mourning, Mr. Thorne. I have a problem, and you are the solution. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his long fingers. A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. You overestimate my charity, Miss Sterling. I am not a white knight. I am the man who breaks the white knight's legs. What makes you think I care about your domestic disputes? Because this isn't a domestic dispute. It's a hostile takeover, Clara said, stepping closer. She unclasped the clutch and pulled out the silver flash drive, placing it deliberately on the table between them. Richard Vance isn't just trying to marry me to clear my stepmother's debts. He's using my family's remaining real estate holdings to build a commercial zoning block along the waterfront. He is trying to choke out your shipping lanes. Julian's eyes flicked to the drive, then back to her face. The casual amusement vanished, replaced by an intense, terrifying focus. And what exactly is on that drive? Everything, Clara said, her voice ringing with absolute certainty. Vance's offshore accounts, the bribes to the Port Authority, the names of the hitmen he used to clear out the union leaders last year. It is the key to entirely dismantling his political career and putting him in federal prison for the rest of his miserable life. Julian remained perfectly still. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant murmur of the casino floor. Assuming you are telling the truth, and assuming you haven't triggered a trap, Julian said slowly, why bring it to me? Why not the FBI? The district attorney. Because the district attorney is Arthur Pendleton, and he is the one who brokered the marriage deal. The system is bought and paid for. If I hand this to the law, the drive disappears, and I am found floating in the harbor. Clara leaned forward, resting her hands flat on the poker table. I don't want justice, Mr. Thorne. I want ruin. I want to crush them so entirely that they can never hurt another woman again. As Clara pressed her hands against the green felt, the harsh overhead light caught the skin of her wrists and the backs of her hands. The intricate, silvery webbing of severe burn scars, a remnant of a horrific childhood accident she had survived long ago, shimmered starkly against her pale skin. Julian's gaze dropped to her hands. The change in him was instantaneous and violent. The color drained from his face. The rigid, perfect control he exuded snapped. He inhaled sharply, a ragged, involuntary sound, and pushed his chair back from the table as if he had been physically struck. His eyes widened, locked onto the scars, his pupils dilating in an instinctual, raw panic. For a fraction of a second, he wasn't the terrifying mob boss. He was someone plunging into a deeply traumatic flashback. Clara froze, instantly recognizing the signs. She had spent years working with severe trauma survivors. PTSD, her mind registered immediately. A visual trigger. She didn't reach for him. She didn't offer a platitude. Instead, Clara slowly, deliberately pulled her hands off the table and folded them behind her back, removing the trigger from his line of sight. She lowered her voice, grounding it, making it entirely steady and devoid of threat. 5 things you can see, Julian, she said softly, using the grounding technique without hesitation. The table, the cards, the drive, my dress, the light. You are in the sanctum. You are in control. Julian blinked hard. A muscle feathered violently in his jaw. He dragged a deep, shuddering breath into his lungs, his chest heaving under the tailored suit. He squeezed his eyes shut for one long second, and when he opened them again, the terrified ghost was gone, replaced once more by the icy, calculated king of the underworld. But the dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted. She had seen the crack in the armor, and she had not used it to strike. He stared at her, his expression unreadable. But a new, profound intensity burned in his gray eyes. He looked at the flash drive, then at the woman standing before him, battered, soaked, but utterly unbroken. You are asking for a dangerous alliance, Clara, Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate timbre. If you step behind my doors, you do not walk back out into the light until the war is won. I have no light left to return to, Clara answered, her chin rising. Do we have a deal? Julian reached out and picked up the flash drive. The cold metal glinted in his hand. He looked at Clara Sterling, a woman who had just walked through fire and rain to offer him a kingdom. Marcus, Julian called out, not breaking eye contact with Clara. The massive guard appeared instantly at the velvet rope. Prepare the car. We are going to the estate. Julian stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. Welcome to the syndicate, Miss Sterling. The ride to the Thorne estate was cloaked in a heavy, contemplative silence. Clara sat in the back of the armored Maybach, staring out at the rain-slicked streets of the city through tinted, bulletproof glass. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the casino was beginning to wane, leaving behind an aching exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. Yet her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. She had just handed over her only leverage to Julian Thorne. She was completely at his mercy. Julian sat on the opposite side of the spacious cabin, an impenetrable shadow against the dark leather interior. He had spent the first 20 minutes of the drive silently typing on an encrypted tablet, likely verifying the initial data layers on the flash drive. He hadn't spoken a word to her since they left the sanctum. Clara watched his profile as the streetlights strobed across his face. He was a man composed of sharp angles and dangerous restraint. The brief, terrifying glimpse of his vulnerability at the poker table felt like an illusion, yet she knew it was real. Julian Thorne carried a profound, agonizing trauma. It was an unspoken understanding that hung in the air between them, bridging the vast chasm between the advocate and the mobster. The car turned off the main highway, passing through a dense private forest road before arriving at a set of towering, wrought iron gates. Heavily armed men in tactical gear stepped out of the shadows, their flashlights sweeping the vehicle before the massive gates slowly swung open. The estate was a fortress disguised as a modern architectural masterpiece, built from dark stone, steel, and expansive walls of reinforced glass. It perched on a cliff overlooking the tumultuous ocean. It was beautiful, imposing, and utterly inescapable. As the car glided to a stop beneath a sprawling portico, Marcus opened the door. Clara stepped out into the freezing wind. Wrapping her arms around herself, Julian emerged a second later, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the half-dozen guards stationed around the entrance. Bring her inside. Have Maria prepare the West Wing suite, Julian ordered, his tone brisk and authoritative. Clara stopped in her tracks. Maria, Julian paused, turning back to look at her. A faint, almost imperceptible softness touched his eyes. You didn't really think a battered woman fleeing an abusive enforcer just magically slipped through my city without me knowing, did you? My syndicate is ruthless, Clara, but we do not harbor domestic abusers. When I found out what her husband was doing, I handled him. And when I learned a woman from the East End shelter was funding her escape, I let Maria go. I've been keeping an eye on your work ever since. Clara stared at him, momentarily stunned. The narrative the city told about Julian Thorne was one of absolute, indiscriminate violence. But here he was, revealing a moral compass that, while forged in the dark, pointed to a fiercely protective true north. You let her go, Clara repeated softly. I don't cage survivors, Julian replied. He gestured toward the grand oak doors. Come inside. You're freezing. The interior of the estate was surprisingly warm, minimalist, and elegant. There were no ostentatious displays of wealth, no gilded statues or gaudy chandeliers. It was a space designed for silence and security. A housekeeper, an older, kind-faced woman hurried forward with a thick, heated blanket, draping it over Clara's trembling shoulders. Thank you, Clara whispered, pulling the fabric tight. My office. 5 minutes, Julian said, stripping off his suit jacket and handing it to a waiting guard. We have terms to discuss. 5 minutes later, Clara, wrapped in the warm blanket, and holding a steaming mug of tea the housekeeper had pressed into her hands, stood in the center of Julian's private office. The room was dominated by a massive wall of monitors, currently displaying scrolling lines of encrypted code Vance's ledgers, being decrypted by Julian's unseen tech team. Julian stood by a massive mahogany desk, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. He pushed one across the desk toward her. "I don't drink," Clara said, remaining standing. "It's for the shock. You've had a long night," Julian offered, though he didn't press the issue when she didn't take the glass. He picked up his own, taking a slow sip as he leaned against the edge of the desk, crossing his ankles. He looked at her with a steady, calculating gaze. "The drive is authentic," Julian stated, getting straight to the point. "My team has already bypassed the first firewall. Vance is sloppy. He used a rudimentary cipher for his offshore routing numbers. With this, I can dismantle his operation within a week, dry up his funding, and hand him to the federal authorities on a silver platter." "And Arthur Pendleton?" Clara asked, her voice hardening. "He is the architect. Vance is just the muscle. Pendleton is a sitting district attorney. He is insulated. Taking him down requires a scalpel, not a sledgehammer," Julian explained calmly. "But yes, he will fall with the rest of them. You have my word on that." Clara took a deep breath, the heat of the tea seeping into her scarred hands. "And in return, what is the cost of my protection, Mr. Thorne?" Julian set his glass down. He stood up to his full height, closing the distance between them until he was standing just a few feet away. The sheer physical presence of the man was overwhelming, yet Clara refused to step back. She met his gaze squarely, her chin lifted in defiance. "You think I brought you here to make you a prisoner," Julian said softly. "You think I operate like Vance, like your stepmother, that I see you as a commodity to be traded. In my experience, powerful men do not offer shelter without demanding submission," Clara replied evenly. Julian's jaw tightened. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing the armor she had worn for years, the desperate, unyielding strength that kept her standing. "Let me make something exceptionally clear to you, Clara," Julian said, his voice dropping to a gravelly, intense register. "In my world, women are frequently treated as pawns, as leverage, as currency. I despise it. I have spent a decade eradicating the trafficking rings in this city. I do not buy women. I do not own them. And I will never, under any circumstances, demand your submission." He took a slow step backward, deliberately giving her space. "If you stay here, you stay as an ally, a partner in this specific endeavor," Julian continued, his tone turning fiercely uncompromising. "Bodily autonomy is absolute in this house. No one will ever touch you without your explicit, enthusiastic consent. Not my guards, not my staff, and certainly not me. Your room is your sanctuary. You have a lock on the inside of your door, and you are the only one with the key. Do you understand me?" Clara felt a sudden, unexpected tightness in her throat. The sheer, overwhelming relief of his words, the explicit validation of her agency from the most dangerous man she had ever met, threatened to crack her composure more than the fire had. "I understand," she whispered. "Good." Julian nodded sharply. He turned back to his desk, tapping a command into his tablet. "Now we need to address the immediate threat. My intelligence network flagged a police dispatch 10 minutes ago." Julian turned the tablet around, pushing it across the desk toward Clara. Clara looked at the screen. It was a digitized police report, bearing the seal of the city's psychiatric evaluation board. Her name was at the top, flanked by a bold, red stamp. "Involuntary hold flight risk. Evelyn didn't just report you missing," Julian said, his voice grim. "She filed a fabricated psychiatric affidavit. She claimed the stress of the fire caused a psychotic break, that you are a danger to yourself and others. A judge signed off on it 20 minutes ago. As of right now, you are a wanted fugitive. If you are spotted on the street, the police have authorization to detain you by force, sedate you, and turn you over to a private medical facility owned by Arthur Pendleton. Clara finished, the blood rushing in her ears. She stared at the screen, a cold dread washing over her. They froze my assets. They erased my credibility. If I try to go to the press, I'm just a hysterical, unstable woman spouting conspiracy theories. It is a classic strategy to discredit a witness before they can testify. Julian agreed. Evelyn and Pendleton are trying to trap you in a system where you have no voice. They want to strip you of your agency, so Vance can swoop in as your concerned fiancé and take legal conservatorship over you. Clara closed her eyes. The sheer malice of the plan was staggering. They didn't just want to force her into a marriage. They wanted to erase her identity, to lock her in a padded cell until she broke. The feeling of absolute powerlessness. The very feeling she fought every day to spare other women from threatened to pull her under. But then she opened her eyes, and she saw Julian watching her. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the quiet, expectant respect of a general waiting for his co-commander to make a strategic move. She was not a victim, she was an equal. They think they've backed me into a corner, Clara said, her voice steadying, the steel returning to her spine. She looked up from the tablet, meeting Julian's fierce gaze. They think I'm going to hide. Are you? Julian asked quietly. No, Clara said. She out and tapped the encrypted code scrolling on Julian's massive monitors. Vance is hosting his re-election fundraiser in 3 days at the Grand Hotel. Pendleton will be there. Half the corrupt judges in the city will be there. We are going to decrypt these ledgers, organize the financial trails, and we are going to crash that gala, if they want to paint me as crazy. I'll show them exactly how dangerous a woman with nothing left to lose can be. A slow, genuine smile spread across Julian's face. It transformed his harsh features, revealing a devastating, predatory beauty that made Clara's breath hitch. I have an entire team of forensic accountants at my disposal, Julian said, walking back around the desk to stand beside her. I have the security layout for the Grand Hotel, and I have enough firepower to hold off the National Guard. You provide the strategic insight into Pendleton's legal loopholes, and I provide the hammer to smash them. Clara looked at him, realizing that the boundary lines between their worlds were dissolving. This wasn't just a transaction anymore. It was a crusade. 2 survivors, marked by the fire of their pasts, standing back to back against the dark. We do this together, Julian, Clara said, extending her scarred hand toward him. As equals, we don't just stop Vance. We tear their entire empire down to the bedrock. Julian looked at her hand. For a fleeting second, the hesitation returned, the echo of a trauma that had dictated his life for decades. But as he looked into Clara's eyes that held no pity, only a fierce, unwavering solidarity, he made a choice. He reached out and firmly grasped her hand. His grip was warm, solid, and completely devoid of hesitation. To the bedrock, Clara, Julian promised, his voice a vow that resonated deep in the quiet room. We burn it all to the ground. For the next 3 weeks. The sprawling underground war room of the Thorne estate became their entire universe. The outside world ceased to exist, replaced by the relentless, mesmerizing glow of multi-monitor arrays, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards, and the quiet hum of Julian's central servers. Clara practically lived in the subterranean command center, fueled by dark coffee, sheer adrenaline, and a burning desire for retribution. She and Julian worked in a synchronized, almost terrifying harmony. He commanded the intelligence network, intercepting encrypted communications and deploying his ghosts across the city, while Clara served as a tactical architect, dissecting Arthur Pendleton's legal labyrinths and finding the financial arteries that kept Senator Vance's political machine alive. They were too brilliant, damaged minds operating on the same lethal frequency. Clara quickly realized that Julian Thorne was not a thug. He was a master chess player who had been forced to use a bloody board. His intellect matched hers at every turn, anticipating her strategies and reinforcing her legal maneuvers with underworld pragmatism. It was in the quiet, agonizingly late hours of the night that the boundaries between the advocate and the syndicate boss began to blur, melting away under the intense heat of their shared crusade. One particular night, the clock on the wall crept past 3 in the morning. The war room was empty save for the two of them. Julian had sent the tech team away to rest, leaving the cavernous space bathed in the cool blue light of the screens. Clara was sitting cross-legged in a massive leather armchair, a pair of reading glasses perched on the bridge of her nose as she meticulously cross-referenced a stack of offshore banking records with a decrypted manifest from the city port. Julian was standing by the tactical table a few feet away, reviewing a topographical map of Vance's newly acquired real estate. He had shed his suit jacket hours ago, his sleeves rolled up to the elbows, exposing the intricate, faded ink of syndicate tattoos that wrapped around his forearms. Clara found her gaze drifting over the hard lines of his profile, the tense set of his shoulders, and the way the blue light cast deep shadows across his striking, scarred features. She had spent her life trying to read the hidden violence in men, but with Julian, there was no hidden violence. There was only a fierce, unwavering protection, a wall of steel erected to keep the darkness out, not to trap it inside. He felt her staring and looked up, his piercing gray eyes catching hers across the dim room. A heavy charged silence descended between them, thick with words they had not yet dared to speak. "You should sleep, Clara," Julian said, his voice a low, rough rumble that sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "Your mind is sharp, but your body is running on fumes. The ledgers will still be here in the morning. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see the shelter burning," Clara admitted softly, pulling her glasses off and rubbing her temples. "I see Arthur Pendleton smiling at the press conference, shaking the mayor's hand while the ashes of my life's work are swept under the rug. We are so close to cracking the final encryption on the Cayman accounts. If I can just link this shell corporation to Pendleton's personal trust, we have the smoking gun." Julian abandoned the tactical table and walked slowly toward her. He stopped just at the edge of her personal space, always hyper-aware of his proximity, always ensuring she never felt cornered. It was a profound, silent respect that moved Clara more deeply than any grand romantic gesture ever could. He looked down at her, his expression softening into something incredibly vulnerable. "You are carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," Julian murmured, his gaze dropping to the burn scars on her hands, which were tightly gripping the edge of a file folder. "You don't have to carry it alone." "Not anymore." Clara looked up at him, her breath catching in her throat. The air in the room suddenly felt entirely too thin. The raw intensity in his eyes was staggering, stripping away the armor she had worn for years. She realized, with a sudden, overwhelming clarity, that she trusted him. She trusted the deadliest man in the city more than she had ever trusted anyone in the light. "Julian," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't move, but the muscle in his jaw feathered. "I made a promise to you, Clara. I told you that my doors were a sanctuary. I will not cross a line. I will not push you." Clara stood up slowly, the file folder slipping from her lap to the floor. She closed the remaining distance between them until she was standing mere inches away from him. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, could smell the intoxicating scent of bergamot, dark coffee, and raw, unrestrained masculinity. "What if I want you to cross it?" Clara asked, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Julian went perfectly still, his eyes widening slightly, a violent war waged behind his gray gaze, the desperate, starving need of a man who had denied himself human connection for a decade. Battling against the deeply ingrained fear of his own trauma, he raised a hand, his fingers hovering just a fraction of an inch from her cheek, trembling with the sheer force of his restraint. "I have not touched a woman in 10 years, Clara," Julian confessed, his voice breaking into a ragged whisper. "Since the day I was taken from the foster system. The world has taught me that physical contact is either a weapon or a trap. If I touch you, I need you to understand that I am completely, utterly at your mercy. You have the power to break me, Tears pricked the corners of Clara's eyes. She understood the magnitude of what he was offering her. He wasn't just offering his body. He was placing his shattered, guarded soul entirely in her scarred hands. "I will never break you," Julian, Clara vowed fiercely. She reached up, slowly and deliberately, and placed her scarred hand flat against the center of his chest, right over his racing heart. "I am right here. We are equals in this. You are safe with me." A shudder ripped through Julian's massive frame. The hesitation finally shattered. He closed the gap, bringing his hands up to cup her face with a reverence that was entirely breathtaking. His touch was incredibly gentle, mapping the contours of her cheekbones, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. Clara leaned into his warmth, a soft gasp escaping her lips as his mouth finally met hers. The kiss was a revelation. It wasn't the frantic, aggressive claiming of a mob boss. It was a slow, agonizingly sweet exploration, a desperate seeking of solace and salvation. Julian kissed her like she was the only oxygen left in a dying world, pouring years of silent longing and buried tenderness into the connection. Clara responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer, demanding more. The passion ignited between them like a wildfire, burning away the shadows of their respective traumas. When he finally pulled back to breathe, his forehead resting against hers, Julian was trembling. "Clara," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. "Take me upstairs." "Julian," she whispered, her eyes dark with absolute certainty. That night, in the sprawling, secure master suite overlooking the raging ocean, they dismantled the final walls between them. Every touch was preceded by a question, every movement a masterclass in profound consent and mutual worship. Julian treated her body as a sacred temple, worshipping the strength in her scars, making love to her with a ferocious, breathtaking devotion that left Clara weeping from the sheer beauty of it. He gave her back the ownership of her own skin, and in return, she anchored him, proving that intimacy could be a sanctuary rather than a battlefield. As they lay tangled in the tangled silk sheets as the dawn broke over the horizon, Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat. She felt an overwhelming, terrifying surge of love for this broken, beautiful man. They were no longer just allies. They were bound together by something far deeper than blood or vengeance. 2 days later, the breakthrough finally arrived. It was mid-afternoon. Clara was staring at a complex web of routed transactions when a specific sequence of numbers suddenly aligned. She froze, her eyes widening as the decryption algorithm flashed green across the massive central monitor. "Julian," Clara shouted, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. Julian rushed into the war room, flanked by two of his top lieutenants. He crossed the floor in long, urgent strides, coming to a halt behind her chair. "What is it?" "I have it," Clara breathed, her fingers flying across the keyboard to lock the data path. "The final shell company in the Cayman Islands. It's a blind trust. But the routing sequence matches the exact encrypted key we pulled from Vance's private server. The beneficiary of the trust isn't Richard Vance." She hit the final execution key, and a digitized document rendered on the screen. At the bottom of the document, printed in stark, undeniable black and white, was the name, Arthur Pendleton. "He's the architect," Julian said, his voice dropping to a lethal, icy calm. "Vance is just the frontman. Pendleton has been using the district attorney's office to seize waterfront properties under eminent domain, passing them to Vance's development firm, and washing the profits through this blind trust. It's a multi-million-dollar racketeering operation, operating right under the nose of the federal government. We have the smoking gun." "Julian," Clara said, turning around in her chair to look at him, a triumphant, fierce smile lighting up her face. "This ledger proves direct financial complicity. It shows every bribe, every kickback, every illegal seizure. We have everything we need to bypass the local courts and take this straight to the director of the FBI. We can destroy them." Julian looked at the screen, then down at Clara. The pride in his eyes was blinding. He reached out, his hand resting warmly on her shoulder. You did it, Clara. You dismantled the most corrupt political machine in this state with nothing but a flash drive and your brilliant mind. A wave of profound relief washed over Clara. For the first time since the shelter burned, she felt the crushing weight lift from her chest. They had won. The nightmare was ending. Pendleton and Vance would be exposed. Evelyn would be implicated as a co-conspirator, and Clara would be free. They had secured their future. Send the compilation to the Ghost servers, Julian ordered his tech lieutenant. Lock the physical drives in the vault. We initiate the data drop to the federal secure line at midnight. Julian turned back to Clara, a rare, genuine smile gracing his lips. He pulled her up from the chair and into his arms, kissing her deeply. A celebration of their shared victory. We did it. He whispered against her lips. You are safe now, I promise you. But in the underworld, safety is the most dangerous illusion of all. At exactly 11:42 p.m., the estate's internal alarm system didn't blare. It whispered. The ambient lighting in the war room instantly shifted from cool blue to a pulsing, urgent crimson red. A low, synchronized hum vibrated through the concrete floor as the blast doors across the compound automatically began to seal. Clara ripped her gaze away from Julian, her heart leaping into her throat. What is that? Julian was already moving, his instincts taking over in a fraction of a second. He lunged toward the central tactical console, his fingers flying across the security overrides. Perimeter breach, he barked, his voice devoid of panic but laced with absolute, terrifying authority. Marcus, give me a setrep. Where is the breach? Silence emanated from the comm system for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, a static-laced, choked voice came through the speaker. Front gates. Boss, they didn't breach the wall. The gates. The gates were opened from the inside. The blood drained completely from Clara's face. The estate was an impenetrable fortress. The biometric locks on the main gates required dual authorization from the central guardhouse. The only way the gates could open without triggering a massive external firefight was if someone inside the guardhouse had initiated the override. Show me the gate feed, Julian commanded, his jaw locked tight. The massive central monitor flickered, switching from the decrypted ledgers to a high definition night vision feed of the estate's main entrance. What Clara saw on that screen shattered her reality into a million jagged pieces. Standing inside the secure guardhouse, her hand resting on the manual override lever, was a woman. She was trembling, her face pale and streaked with tears, looking terrified as heavily armed. Tactical SWAT vans began pouring through the massive iron gates she had just opened. It wasn't a hardened syndicate traitor. It wasn't one of Julian's lieutenants bought by a rival mob boss. It was Sarah. Sarah the quiet, gentle woman who had arrived at Clara's shelter 2 years ago with a broken orbital bone and a toddler clinging to her leg. Sarah, whom Clara had personally housed, fed and protected from a violently abusive ex-husband. Sarah, who had come to Clara 3 weeks ago begging for a job, claiming her ex had found her again, and whom Clara had convinced Julian to hire as an administrative assistant within the secure walls of the estate to keep her safe. No, Clara whispered, the word tearing from her throat in a strangled gasp. No, Julian, that's impossible. That's Sarah. She wouldn't. She couldn't. Julian stared at the screen, processing the catastrophic betrayal with a horrifying, clinical detachment. Pendleton, he said softly, the realization dawning like a death sentence. He didn't need to buy one of my men. He knew you would bring your strays with you. He found her. He leveraged her, as if on cue. The secondary camera feed switched to the exterior of the guardhouse. A man stepped out of the lead SWAT van. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing an impeccable, tailored trench coat. Arthur Pendleton walked up to the guardhouse window, holding up a small tablet screen to displaying a live video feed of a terrified child tied to a chair. Sarah's child. Pendleton smiled, a cold reptilian curvature of the lips, and nodded to the woman inside. Sarah collapsed to the floor of the guardhouse, sobbing hysterically as the mercenaries surged past her, flooding the compound. Clara stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the desk. The air vanished from her lungs. The betrayal struck her with the force of a physical blow, absolute and devastating. Her life's work, her profound belief in the goodness of the women she saved. Her empathy, Pendleton had weaponized all of it. He had taken her greatest virtue and turned it into the dagger that was now plunging into Julian's back. She had brought the Trojan horse into the fortress. She was the reason the man she loved was about to die. The peak of despair crushed her. A suffocating, paralyzing darkness. She fell to her knees on the cold concrete floor, covering her mouth with her scarred hands as a silent, agonizing scream ripped through her chest. Julian didn't look at the screen anymore. He didn't look at the tactical readouts. He dropped to his knees right in front of Clara, grabbing her shoulders and forcing her to look into his eyes. "Clara, listen to me," Julian ordered, his voice cutting through her spiraling panic like a beacon. "This is not your fault. Do you hear me? Compassion is not a weakness. It is the bravest choice a human being can make. Pendleton is a monster for exploiting it. But you are not to blame for having a heart. They're going to kill you because of me," she sobbed, terror completely overriding her logic. Julian pulled a heavy, matte black Glock 19 from the holster at the small of his back, chambering around with a sharp, metallic clack. He looked at her, the terrifying, lethal king of the underworld fully awakened, his eyes burning with a fierce, absolute promise of violence. "No one is dying tonight, except the men who just walked through my gates," Julian said. He hauled her to her feet, his grip like iron. "We are leaving." Now, the invasion was not a police raid. It was a highly coordinated military execution. Pendleton had not brought cops looking to make an arrest. He had brought a privately funded army of black market mercenaries disguised in SWAT tactical gear, heavily armed with assault rifles, flashbangs, and breaching charges. Their objective was clear: eradicate everyone inside the compound and burn the evidence to ash. As Julian dragged Clara out of the war room and into the subterranean access corridor, the entire foundation of the estate shook violently. A deafening explosion roared from the upper levels, shaking dust and debris from the ceiling. They had blown the main reinforced doors to the mansion. "Marcus, initiate Protocol Omega." Julian barked into his earpiece as they sprinted down the dimly lit hallway. "All remaining personnel fall back to the subterranean tunnels. Defensive line at the Armory Junction. Do not engage in a prolonged firefight on the upper floors. They have superior numbers. We bottleneck them below." "Copy that, boss," falling back. Marcus's voice crackled through the comms, underscored by the terrifying, continuous staccato of automatic gunfire. Clara ran blindly, her hand locked in Julian's vice-like grip. Her lungs burned, her mind struggling to process the apocalyptic chaos erupting around her. The estate, which only moments ago had felt like the safest place on earth, was rapidly transforming into a slaughterhouse. They reached the Armory Junction just as a squad of Julian's loyal guards fell back down the main stairwell, returning fire upward into the smoke-filled atrium. The air was thick with the acrid stench of cordite, pulverized drywall, and the copper tang of blood. Two of the guards were wounded, leaning heavily on their comrades. "The main hall is lost, Mr. Thorne," a bleeding lieutenant reported, swapping a spent magazine for a fresh one with trembling hands. "There are at least 40 of them, heavily armored. They're sweeping room by room. Hold this line for exactly 3 minutes. Then blow the stairwell charges and fall back to the river tunnels," Julian commanded, his tactical mind operating with icy, frightening efficiency. He turned to Clara, his eyes scanning her rapidly to ensure she wasn't injured. "We are going down into the old smuggling routes. They lead directly out to the river gorge behind the estate. I have a speedboat hidden in a subterranean grotto. We get on that boat, we disappear into the delta, and we regroup." Clara nodded, forcing her terror down, channeling the sheer, unyielding survival instinct that had kept her alive this long. Okay, let's go." Julian led her past the defensive line, moving deeper into the subterranean levels of the estate. The modern concrete walls soon gave way to older, damp rock formations. These were the original smuggling tunnels, carved out during the Prohibition era, a labyrinthine network of dark, narrow passages that Julian had kept maintained as a catastrophic failsafe. The air grew heavy and cold, smelling of moss and river water. They ran in near darkness, guided only by the emergency luminescent strips running along the floor. Behind them, the muffled, thunderous roar of the stairwell charges detonating echoed through the tunnels, sealing off the primary access point and buying them precious time. But Pendleton was not a man who left things to chance. He knew who he was dealing with. He knew Julian Thorne would have an escape route. They were about a quarter of a mile into the tunnel system, moving rapidly toward the sound of rushing water. When the second catastrophe struck, it wasn't a sound at first. It was a massive, violent shift in the air pressure. Clara felt her eardrums pop painfully, followed a microsecond later by a concussive shock wave that physically lifted her off her feet. Cartel operatives, hired by Pendleton to cut off the escape routes, had planted massive seismic charges on the cliff face directly above the tunnel network. They weren't trying to breach the tunnels. They were trying to collapse them. The explosion was catastrophic. The ceiling of the tunnel 50 yards ahead of them simply ceased to exist, replaced by a terrifying, roaring avalanche of thousands of tons of rock, dirt, and splintered steel support beams. Julian reacted with inhuman speed as the ceiling began to collapse. He tackled Clara backward, throwing his massive body over hers, pinning her to the damp floor as the world ended around them. A deafening, apocalyptic roar drowned out her screams. The air instantly filled with a blinding, choking cloud of pulverized stone and dust. Clara squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face into Julian's chest as debris rained down upon them. Striking Julian's back and shoulders with sickening, heavy thuds, he grunted in pain but did not move an inch, acting as a human shield against the crushing weight of the earth. When the roaring finally stopped, it was replaced by a terrifying, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of small rocks clattering to the floor and their own ragged, coughing breaths. Clara, Julian choked out, his voice hoarse from the dust. "Are you hit? Are you bleeding?" "No," Clara coughed, struggling to push herself up. The air was so thick with dust she could barely see her own hand. "I'm okay, Julian. Are you?" Julian rolled off her, fighting to his feet. He pulled a small tactical flashlight from his belt, the narrow beam cutting through the dense cloud of debris. He shined it forward, and the reality of their situation settled over them like a shroud. The tunnel ahead of them, the route to the subterranean grotto and the speedboat, was completely obliterated. A solid wall of collapsed rock blocked their path, effectively sealing them in. Julian immediately pivoted, shining the light behind them. The tunnel leading back to the estate was still intact. But Marcus and the remaining guards who had been covering their rear were gone, either trapped on the other side of a secondary cave-in or wiped out by the blast. They were completely alone. And they were trapped. "The boat is gone," Julian said, his voice grim. He didn't waste time panicking. He merely analyzed the new tactical reality. "We can't go back. The mercenaries will be digging through the rubble of the stairwell. There is only one other way out." He grabbed Clara's hand and began pulling her toward a narrow, jagged fissure in the tunnel wall, a natural drainage crevasse that sloped steeply downward. "This leads out to the base of the gorge, directly onto the riverbanks. It's exposed. The current is lethal this time of year, and the terrain is completely open. But if we can make it to the tree line on the opposite bank, I have a secondary cache hidden in the woods." "We go," Clara said instantly, refusing to let the despair anchor her. They descended through the narrow, treacherous crevasse, the jagged rocks tearing at Clara's ruined evening gown and scraping her skin. The roar of the river grew louder with every step, a violent, rushing torrent of freezing water cutting through the deep gorge. Finally, they broke through the rock face, stumbling out into the freezing, rain-swept night. They were at the bottom of the gorge. On one side, The massive cliff face rose up to the burning ruins of the Thorn estate. On the other side, 30 yards of violent, churning, freezing black water stood between them and the safety of the dense forest. The rain was coming down in sheets, rendering visibility to almost zero. Julian kept his body positioned between Clara and the cliff face, his gun raised, his eyes scanning the darkness above for any sign of movement. The water is going to be freezing, and the current is incredibly strong. Julian yelled over the roar of the river and the rain. "You hold on to me. Clara, do not let go. I will swim us across." Clara nodded, her teeth chattering uncontrollably from the cold and the adrenaline dump. She stepped forward, preparing to plunge into the freezing black depths, and then she saw it. It was a tiny, innocuous thing, a small bright green dot of light, cutting through the heavy curtain of rain, dancing frantically over the wet rocks before coming to a sudden, dead stop. It rested perfectly in the center of Clara's chest, a sniper, positioned somewhere high up on the cliff face, utilizing thermal optics to cut through the rain. Time seemed to dilate, slowing to an agonizing, molasses-thick crawl. Clara stared at the green laser dot on her chest, her brain struggling to process the absolute, imminent finality it represented. She was going to die, here in the freezing rain, betrayed by her own compassion, hunted by the men who had sworn to uphold the law. She couldn't even scream. Her vocal cords were paralyzed by sheer, overriding terror. But Julian saw it. Julian, who had spent his entire life mastering the art of survival, who had built an empire to ensure he would never be a victim again, did not hesitate for a single, fractional microsecond. He didn't try to shoot back. He didn't try to pull her to cover. Knowing the sniper's finger was already squeezing the trigger, "Clara," Julian roared, a sound of absolute, raw desperation that tore through the night. He lunged forward with explosive, terrifying speed. He didn't just push her. He threw his entire massive body directly into her line of sight, interposing himself between Clara and the sniper on the cliff. The catastrophic event unfolded in a horrifying, chaotic blur. The sharp, supersonic crack of a high-caliber sniper rifle echoed off the gorge walls, a sound completely different from the automatic gunfire above. Clara felt the immense, heavy impact of Julian's body crashing into hers, driving the breath from her lungs. She heard a sickening, wet thud as the high-velocity bullet struck flesh and bone. Julian's momentum carried them both backward, right over the edge of the slick rocks and into the violent, churning abyss of the river. The freezing water hit Clara like a physical blow, shocking her system, stealing the air from her lungs. The current instantly gripped them, a monstrous, invisible hand dragging them under the black surface. She flailed frantically in the freezing darkness, her hand desperately seeking Julian. She found his jacket, gripping the fabric with all her remaining strength as they broke the surface for a brief, gasping second. "Julian," Clara screamed, coughing up freezing river water. A flash of lightning illuminated the gorge. Clara saw him. Julian was floating beside her, his face deathly pale, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The center of his chest was a horrific, blooming mass of crimson, the blood washing away instantly into the violent river current. The sniper's bullet had struck him squarely in the chest. He had taken the kill shot meant for her. Julian looked at her, fighting the agonizing trauma of the massive chest wound, fighting the freezing current that was dragging him down. His lips moved, but the roar of the river drowned out his voice. Yet Clara read the desperate, final command in his gray eyes: survive. The current suddenly violently surged, hitting a massive submerged boulder. The impact ripped Julian's jacket from Clara's freezing, numb fingers. "No," Clara shrieked, lunging forward, her hands grasping desperately at the black water. "Julian, no, hold on," but he was gone. The violent, churning river swallowed Julian Thorne whole, dragging his bleeding, broken body down into the freezing, impenetrable depths. Clara was swept away by the current, battered against the rocks, drowning in the freezing black water. The deafening roar of the river filled her ears, a violent, chaotic symphony of destruction. But then, as her lungs burned for oxygen and the darkness began to claim the edges of her vision, the roar of the water began to strangely distort. It shifted, morphing into a high-pitched, agonizing ringing, a deafening tinnitus that drowned out the storm, drowned out the world, echoing the utter, catastrophic shattering of her soul. Clara opened her mouth in the freezing black water, letting out a raw, silent, muted scream of absolute despair as the river dragged her down into the dark. The freezing black water never truly receded. It lived in her lungs, a phantom weight that stole the oxygen from her breath every time she closed her eyes. 2 months had passed since the night the river swallowed Julian Thorne, yet Clara Sterling remained trapped in that violent, churning abyss. Her reality had fractured into a static, colorless nightmare, confined within the opulent, sterile walls of Evelyn's sprawling country estate. Clara was a ghost haunting a gilded cage, her spirit seemingly broken on the jagged rocks of the gorge. The media had spun a magnificent, horrific lie. According to the evening news, the brave and tragic Clara Sterling had survived a terrifying kidnapping ordeal orchestrated by the late, notorious crime boss Julian Thorne, her stepmother, Evelyn, and the heroic district attorney Arthur Pendleton had miraculously negotiated her release just before Thorne met his fiery, watery end in a botched escape attempt. The narrative was seamless, impenetrable, and backed by the full weight of the corrupt state apparatus. The world believed Clara was a traumatized victim, recovering in the loving embrace of her family. They did not know she was a prisoner of war. The physical toll of her grief was profound. Clara had lost weight, her cheekbones sharp and pronounced, her dark eyes hollowed out by relentless insomnia. She spent her days sitting by the reinforced glass window of her locked suite, staring out at the manicured lawns heavily patrolled by armed mercenaries wearing unmarked tactical gear. She was permitted no phone, no internet access, and no contact with the outside world. Her meals were brought on silver trays by silent, terrified staff members who had been threatened into absolute compliance. Clara existed in a state of suspended animation, her sharp, brilliant mind dulled by the sheer, crushing magnitude of her loss. Julian was dead, the man who had looked past her scars, who had offered her equality in a world that demanded submission, had taken a bullet meant for her heart. He had given his life to buy her breath, and she was squandering it by simply waiting for the inevitable end. But the human body harbors its own profound, undeniable truths, defying the despair of the mind. The realization did not arrive like a sudden thunderclap. It crept in slowly, an insidious series of physical betrayals that Clara initially dismissed as the manifestations of profound trauma. The crippling morning nausea, the bone-deep exhaustion that kept her tethered to the mattress, the strange, metallic aversions to the smell of the rich food they placed before her. It was only on the morning of the 61st day, as she knelt on the cold marble floor of her ensuite bathroom, gripping the porcelain sink until her scarred knuckles turned white, that the horrific, miraculous arithmetic finally aligned in her mind. Her cycle was late, 2 months late. The physical symptoms were not the ghosts of grief. They were the undeniable heralds of new life. Clara pushed herself up from the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs with the frantic, terrifying cadence of a trapped bird. She moved to the mirror, staring at her pale, hollow reflection. Her trembling hands moved downward, resting flat against the subtle, still flat expanse of her lower abdomen. The breath hitched in her throat, escaping as a ragged, disbelieving sob. Julian, she was carrying Julian's child. The magnitude of the revelation crashed over her, a tidal wave of paralyzing terror and agonizing, radiant joy. He was not entirely gone. A piece of the man she loved, the heir to a fallen empire, was currently taking root in the darkness of her womb. The child was a miracle forged in the fires of their shared crusade, a testament to the brief, blindingly beautiful sanctuary they had found in each other's arms. But in this house, surrounded by her enemies, the child was also a death sentence. If Evelyn or Pendleton discovered she was carrying the heir to the Thorne Syndicate, They would not hesitate. They would not allow a biological tether to Julian Thorne to exist, a potential rallying point for the fractured remnants of his empire. They would forcibly terminate the pregnancy, or worse, they would wait until the child was born and use it as an unbreakable chain around Clara's neck for the rest of her natural life. The peak of despair that had threatened to drown her in the river now solidified into a crushing, suffocating reality. She was utterly alone, stripped of her allies, her resources, and her freedom, bearing a secret that could get her and her unborn child killed. Clara slid down the wall, curling her knees to her chest as she wept silently, the tears tracking hot and fast down her cheeks. She felt entirely, desperately helpless. She had no weapons, no armor, no way out. An hour later, the heavy deadbolt on her bedroom door clicked, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Clara hastily wiped her face, forcing the mask of aristocratic, numb compliance back into place as she stood up. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing her stepmother, Evelyn, flanked by two armed guards. Evelyn was dressed impeccably in a tailored Chanel suit, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed, a predator wearing the skin of high society. Behind her stepped Arthur Pendleton, the district attorney, his silver hair catching the morning light, his expression radiating a cold, paternalistic triumph. He looked at Clara with the indulgent, slightly pitying gaze of a warden inspecting a particularly troublesome inmate who had finally been broken. "Good morning, Clara," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and dripping with fabricated concern. "You look pale. I hope the isolation has given you ample time to reflect on the foolishness of your recent choices." Clara did not speak. She kept her hands folded tightly in front of her, deliberately keeping them away from her stomach. She stared at Pendleton, channeling every ounce of her remaining strength to keep the venom out of her eyes. "We have come to a critical juncture," Clara, Pendleton began, stepping into the room and gesturing for the guards to remain in the hall. He closed the door behind him, seizing the three of them in the opulent, suffocating space. "The public narrative has been incredibly sympathetic to your plight. You are the tragic heroine, rescued from the clutches of a monster. The city is ready to see you heal, to see you move forward, and it is time to formalize that recovery. Senator Vance has been remarkably patient, considering the embarrassment your little runaway stunt caused him. I will not marry Richard Vance," Clara said, her voice a low, raspy whisper. It was a reflexive defiance, the last embers of a dying fire. Pendleton sighed, exchanging a weary glance with Evelyn, like a parent dealing with a petulant child. "I was hoping we could avoid the unpleasantness. Clara, I truly was. But you leave me no choice." Pendleton reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit and withdrew a sleek, encrypted tablet. He tapped the screen and held it up for Clara to see. The video feed was live, the timestamp ticking away in the corner. It showed a damp, concrete holding cell, kneeling on the floor, their hands zip-tied behind their backs and their faces bruised and bloodied, were three people. Clara recognized them instantly. It was Marcus, Julian's towering head of security, Maria, the battered woman Clara had helped escape years ago, and Dr. Eris, the underground physician who treated the syndicate's wounded. They were the last loyal remnants of Julian's inner circle, the people who had fought and bled to protect her. Behind them stood two of Pendleton's mercenaries, their assault rifles leveled at the backs of the prisoners' heads. "Julian Thorne is dead," Clara, Pendleton said, his voice dropping the veneer of paternal warmth, revealing the absolute, chilling malice beneath. "His empire is fractured, leaderless, and currently being absorbed by my associates. These three individuals are the last loose ends. They are currently being held in a secure, off-the-books facility. Their survival is entirely dependent on your cooperation." Clara's breath hitched, her eyes widening in horror as she stared at the screen. Marcus looked up at the camera, his face a battered mask of defiance, but Maria was weeping silently. They had been hunted down. Pendleton had systematically dismantled everything Julian had built, and he was using the survivors to tighten the noose around Clara's neck. Furthermore, Evelyn chimed in, stepping closer to Clara, her perfume thick and cloying. The land where your pathetic little shelter once stood has been rezoned. We are breaking ground on the Vance Commercial Plaza next week. But if you refuse to cooperate, Arthur has assured me that the construction crews will happen to discover a mass grave of syndicate victims buried on the property. The legacy of your shelter will be forever synonymous with mass murder. Your reputation, and the memory of every woman you tried to save, will be utterly annihilated. The trap was flawlessly executed, closing around her with the crushing weight of a hydraulic press. Pendleton and Evelyn had stripped away every possible avenue of resistance. They held the lives of innocent people in their hands, and they were threatening to desecrate the only good thing Clara had ever built. If she fought them, people died. If she ran, the legacy of her life's work would be destroyed. She was a pawn on a chessboard where the king had already been slaughtered, and she was completely surrounded by the enemy. The wedding is scheduled for 4 weeks from today, Pendleton stated, tucking the tablet back into his pocket. It will be the social event of the season, a symbol of your triumphant return to society. You will smile for the cameras. You will sign the marriage certificate, transferring legal conservatorship of your trust to Richard. You will be a dutiful, silent, and compliant wife. If you do this, Marcus, Maria, and the doctor will be quietly exiled out of the country. They will live. If you hesitate, if you attempt to send a message, if you try to harm yourself, I will have them executed on a live feed, and I will force you to watch. The absolute, profound helplessness threatened to snap Clara's mind. She looked at Evelyn, the woman who had promised to protect her after her father died. She looked at Pendleton, the man who had mentored her, who had taught her the intricacies of the law, who had sat at her dining table and smiled. They were monsters, wearing the tailored suits of civilized society. And they had won. She was defeated. The advocate who had fought so fiercely for the autonomy of others was being sold into domestic slavery. But as Clara lowered her head, a strange, terrifying calm began to spread through her veins. It started in her chest, radiating outward, a cold, hard crystallization of her grief. She placed her scarred hand flat against her stomach, a subtle, protective gesture that went entirely unnoticed by the predators in the room. Julian. He had thrown himself in front of a sniper's bullet to ensure she drew her next breath. He had told her that compassion was not a weakness. He had looked at her and seen an equal. If she surrendered now, if she let her spirit break, Julian's sacrifice would be meaningless. She was carrying his heir. She was carrying the future of the empire they had sworn to tear down to the bedrock. Clara lifted her head. The tears had stopped. Her dark eyes, hollowed out by grief only moments ago, now burned with a chilling, absolute obsidian fire. She looked at Pendleton, not with the terror of a victim, but with the dead, calculating gaze of an executioner measuring a target for the gallows. She would not fight them today. She would not scream or rage. She would put on the white dress. She would play the role of the broken, compliant lamb. She would hide the child growing inside her with every breath she took, guarding the secret with a ferocity that would make the devil himself tremble. I will marry him, Clara said, her voice perfectly smooth, devoid of all emotion. It was the voice of a ghost. I will sign the papers. Just keep them alive. Pendleton smiled, a sickening expression of total victory. A wise decision. Clara, I always knew you were a pragmatic girl. The tailors will be here this afternoon for your dress fitting. Do try to look alive. As Evelyn and Pendleton turned and exited the room, the heavy deadbolt clicking shut behind them, Clara did not collapse. She stood perfectly still in the center of the gilded cage, her hand resting over her womb. She was completely trapped, forced to marry a sadistic monster. Her allies held hostage, her life entirely out of her control. But they had made one fatal miscalculation. They believed they had broken the advocate. They did not realize they had merely forged the queen of the underworld. Clara looked out the reinforced window at the heavily armed guards patrolling the estate. She would play their game. She would walk down the aisle. But she would not do it as a victim. She would do it as a Trojan horse, carrying the ultimate weapon in secret, waiting for the perfect moment to burn their empire to the ground from the inside out. The next 4 weeks were a masterclass in psychological endurance. Clara existed in a state of hypervigilant dissociation, navigating the opulent, suffocating reality of her impending forced marriage to Senator Richard Vance. The preparation for the wedding of the century were a grotesque spectacle of wealth and political theater, designed to cement Vance's image as the benevolent savior of a traumatized heiress. Clara was paraded through endless dress fittings, cake tastings, and highly controlled media photo opportunities, her face arranged in a perfect, vacant mask of fragile gratitude. Every move she made was meticulously monitored by Evelyn's private security detail. Every conversation was recorded. Every bite of food was observed. She was a prized mare being groomed for the auction block, her humanity systematically erased to make room for her utility. Yet beneath the compliant facade, Clara's brilliant mind was operating at a lethal, terrifying velocity. The discovery of her pregnancy had fundamentally altered her chemical makeup, replacing her paralyzing grief with a cold, biological imperative to survive and destroy. She was meticulously cataloging the security protocols of the estate, noting the shift changes of the guards, the blind spots in the camera network, and the specific technological infrastructures Pendleton utilized to maintain his control. She knew that brute force was impossible. She was a pregnant woman locked in a fortress. Her only weapon was information, and her only battlefield was the digital ether. The opportunity presented itself on the 3rd week, during a particularly grueling strategy dinner hosted in Evelyn's formal dining room. Senator Vance, Arthur Pendleton, and several key political donors were present, discussing the zoning permits for the new waterfront commercial plaza, the very project Julian had died trying to stop. Clara sat silently at the end of the long mahogany table, pushing an unseasoned piece of chicken around her plate, her stomach rolling with the familiar, suppressed nausea of her first trimester. She focused entirely on breathing, ensuring no one noticed the subtle changes in her body. As the wine flowed and the men grew increasingly arrogant, Vance leaned back in his chair, pulling his encrypted, government-issued smartphone from his pocket. He checked a message, scoffed arrogantly, and tossed the device carelessly onto the table beside his wine glass before turning to deeply engage in a conversation with a donor about offshore tax shelters. Clara stared at the phone. It was the key to the kingdom. Vance's phone would have unrestricted access to Pendleton's shared cloud servers, the very servers that held the unredacted ledgers Clara and Julian's had spent weeks decrypting before the raid. If she could access that phone, she could bypass the estate's internal network jammers and initiate a data transfer directly to the outside world. She needed a distraction, not a subtle one, but something visceral enough to break the attention of highly trained security personnel. Clara deliberately picked up her crystal water goblet, her hand trembling slightly. She brought it to her lips, and then, with calculated precision, allowed her eyes to roll back into her head. She let her body go completely limp, her chair tipping backward as she collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. The crystal goblet shattered against the hardwood, sending water and shards of glass exploding across the room. Chaos erupted instantly. Evelyn shrieked. Chairs scraped violently against the floor, and the guards stationed at the doors rushed forward. Vance cursed, jumping up from the table in the ensuing pandemonium as multiple sets of hands grabbed Clara, pulling her up and shouting for a medical kit. She allowed her right hand to flail wildly, sweeping across the edge of the mahogany table. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of Vance's smartphone. With the practiced, sleight-of-hand desperation of a survivalist, she palmed the device, instantly sliding it up the wide, flowing sleeve of her silk evening gown, securing it against her forearm with the tension of the fabric. Give her air. Stand back. Evelyn was yelling, fanning Clara's face as the guards hauled her into a sitting position against the wall. Clara fluttered her eyes open, groaning softly, playing the role of the frail, traumatized victim to absolute perfection. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice weak and trembling. I felt dizzy. The room was spinning. You haven't been eating properly, Clara, Pendleton said, his voice laced with annoyance rather than concern. He looked at the guards. Take her up to her room. Have the estate doctor check her vitals. We cannot afford her looking like a corpse in the wedding photos next week. Clara allowed the guards to essentially carry her up the grand staircase and deposit her onto the massive four-poster bed in her locked suite. The estate doctor, a man firmly on Evelyn's payroll, arrived minutes later. He took her blood pressure, declared it slightly low due to stress and malnutrition, and ordered her to rest. Clara held her breath the entire time, terrified he would insist on drawing blood, which would immediately reveal the pregnancy hormones surging through her system. But the doctor, lazy and arrogant, merely prescribed bed rest and a sedative, which Clara palmed and hid beneath her mattress the moment he turned his back. When the heavy deadbolt finally clicked shut, leaving her alone in the dark, Clara did not sleep. She waited exactly 2 hours, listening to the rhythmic pacing of the guard in the hallway outside her door. When the pacing settled into a monotonous, predictable routine, she slipped out of bed, retreating to the small, windowless master bathroom. She turned on the shower, letting the water run hot to create a mask of white noise, and sat on the cold tile floor, pulling Vance's stolen smartphone from her sleeve. Her heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She had a narrow window before Vance realized the device was missing and initiated a remote wipe. She powered on the screen. It was locked with a biometric thumbprint scanner and a complex alphanumeric passcode. Clara closed her eyes, forcing her mind to travel back to the underground war room, to the hours she had spent watching Julian's tech lieutenants dissect the habits of corrupt men. Vance is arrogant, Julian had said. He believes his physical security is absolute, which makes his digital security lazy. He uses the same sequence for his offshore accounts as he does for his personal devices. It's an ego trip. Clara typed in the 6-digit sequence she had memorized from the decrypted Cayman Islands ledger, the date of Vance's first successful senatorial election, followed by his own initials. The screen flashed green, unlocking instantly. Clara let out a shaky, triumphant breath. Julian was right. Vance was a creature of massive, fatal ego. Her fingers flew across the digital keyboard with terrifying speed. She bypassed the standard applications, diving directly into the secure, partitioned drives that Vance used to communicate with Pendleton. There it was, the shared cloud directory, the unredacted ledgers, the blackmail files, the offshore routing numbers, the direct evidence tying Arthur Pendleton, Richard Vance, and Evelyn Sterling to systemic racketeering, bribery, and the murder of Julian Thorne's men. It was the holy grail of political destruction. Clara didn't hesitate. She knew she couldn't rely on the local authorities, the state, police, or any localized branch of the justice system. Pendleton's roots ran too deep. She needed the absolute highest echelon of federal oversight. She needed a power structure that could crush Pendleton before he even knew he was bleeding. She opened an encrypted email client and drafted a new message, attaching the entire massive data file. She addressed it directly to the personal, secure inbox of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in Washington. DC, an email address she had memorized years ago during her advocacy work, back when she foolishly believed the system was designed to protect people. She didn't write a plea for help. She wrote an execution order, Director. Attached is undeniable. Forensic proof of systemic racketeering, extortion, and murder orchestrated by District Attorney Arthur Pendleton and Senator Richard Vance. The data includes offshore routing sequences, bribe ledgers, and hit squad manifests. The targets are currently centralizing their operations in this city. If you act immediately, you can dismantle the largest political corruption ring on the eastern seaboard. If you ignore this, The blood of the next victims is on your hands. Clara stared at the glowing send button. This was it. This was the culmination of everything she and Julian had fought for. This was the vengeance he had died to secure. She took a deep, steadying breath, pressing her scarred thumb against the screen. The progress bar filled rapidly, utilizing Vance's priority cellular network to bypass the estate's jammers. 10%, 50%. Message sent. A digital delivery receipt popped up on the screen, confirming the data packet had successfully breached the FBI director's secure firewall and landed in his direct inbox. Clara dropped the phone onto the tile floor, leaning back against the cold porcelain of the bathtub. A profound, overwhelming wave of relief washed over her, so intense it brought fresh tears to her eyes. She covered her face with her hands, letting out a ragged, silent sob. It was done. The evidence was in the hands of the federal government. The cavalry was coming. She had navigated the impossible labyrinth. She had outsmarted the monsters. And she had used the law to finally bring them to their knees. Pendleton and Vance would be arrested within hours. Marcus, Maria, and the doctor would be rescued by federal tactical teams. And Clara and her unborn child would finally, truly be safe. The illusion of justice wrapped around her like a warm blanket, soothing the agonizing trauma of the past 2 months. She had won. She had beaten them. She reached down to pick up the phone, intending to execute a hard factory reset to erase her tracks before returning it to the dining room the next morning. But before her fingers could brush the glass screen, the phone vibrated violently against the tiles. The screen illuminated in the dim bathroom. It was an incoming call. The caller ID was restricted, displaying only a string of encrypted zeros. Clara stared at the vibrating device, her blood running instantly cold. The profound relief evaporated, replaced by a creeping, primal terror that settled deep in the marrow of her bones. Vance wouldn't be calling his own missing phone. He would be using a tracker. This was something else. This was a response. With trembling hands, Clara picked up the phone. She swiped the screen to answer, bringing the device slowly to her ear. She didn't speak. She held her breath, listening to the absolute, dead silence on the other end of the line. It really is quite remarkable. Clara, a voice finally purred through the speaker. The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with an arrogant, chilling amusement. It was the voice of a man who held the strings of the universe in his hands and found the struggles of the puppets highly entertaining. It was Arthur Pendleton. Clara's lungs seized. The bathroom spun sickeningly around her. How, she managed to whisper, the words scraping against her paralyzed vocal cords. How did I intercept a highly encrypted data packet sent directly to the personal inbox of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Pendleton chuckled, the sound devoid of any real humor. Oh, Clara. You brilliant, tragic, profoundly naive girl. Did you really think my influence stopped at the state line? Did you truly believe that the system you revere so deeply is immune to the application of massive, unmitigated capital? The truth crashed over Clara like the freezing river water, drowning her completely. The FBI director hadn't just ignored the email. The director's inbox was routed directly to Pendleton. The man who sat at the pinnacle of federal law enforcement was on Pendleton's payroll. The ultimate failsafe. The highest echelon of justice she had placed her final, desperate hope in, was nothing more than another brick in the fortress of the enemy. The director forwarded your little dossier to me approximately 3 minutes ago, asking how I would like him to dispose of it. Pendleton continued, his tone conversational, as if they were discussing the weather. I must say, I am impressed you managed to steal Richard's phone. It shows initiative, but it also demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the world you inhabit. You still believe in the law, Clara. You still believe that the truth is a shield. The truth is merely a commodity, and I happen to hold the monopoly. Clara couldn't breathe. The illusion of safety was shattered, leaving her entirely exposed, standing on the precipice of an abyss with absolutely no safety net. The law could not save her. The government could not save her. The system was not broken. It was operating exactly as it was designed to, protecting the monsters and crushing the innocent. Since you have proven that isolation is not sufficient to curb your rebellious tendencies, Pendleton said, his voice dropping the amusement, hardening into absolute, lethal authority. There will be consequences. I told you what would happen if you attempted to send a message. I am a man of my word. Marcus, your late lover's head of security, is being executed as we speak. Maria and the doctor will follow tomorrow. If you do not immediately surrender the device to the guard outside your door and prepare yourself for the wedding, you have played your final card. Clara, the game is over. The line went dead, leaving only the hollow, mocking dial tone echoing in the silent bathroom. Clara lowered the phone, staring blankly at the dark screen. The peak of despair that she had felt when Julian died paled in comparison to the absolute, apocalyptic devastation that ripped through her now. She had tried to do the right thing. She had tried to use the system, and because of her desperate, naive reliance on a corrupt structure, a good man was dying. Her faith in justice had just killed Marcus. She dropped the phone into the toilet, flushing it away, severing her connection to the digital world. She sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her stomach as a profound, transformative silence settled over her. The Clara Sterling who believed in the law, the advocate who believed that truth would prevail, died on that cold bathroom floor. The illusion of justice was burned away, leaving behind something entirely new, something terrifying and absolute. Julian had warned her. He had told her that dealing with monsters required becoming the hammer. She had tried to use a gavel, and it had shattered in her hands. She looked down at her scarred hands, the physical manifestation of the fire she had survived as a child. She had survived the flames. She had survived the river. She would survive this. As she sat in the dark, the terrified, grieving victim was systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. In her place, a cold, calculating, morally unrestrained entity began to solidify. Pendleton owned the law. He owned the system. He owned the guns. But Clara realized, with a chilling, crystal-clear clarity, that a man who believes he controls everything is profoundly blind to the dagger held by the woman standing right next to him. She would not try to expose them anymore. Exposing them required a functional system of justice to act upon the evidence. She would not rely on the FBI, or the police, or the courts. She would become the executioner herself. She would walk down that aisle in a white dress. She would stand before God and the corrupt elite of the city. She would look Richard Vance and Arthur Pendleton in the eyes, and she would slaughter them herself. The advocate was dead. The queen of the syndicate had finally awakened, and she was going to burn the world down to protect her child. They forced her into a white dress, preparing a lamb for slaughter. They didn't realize she was wearing a wire, and the wolf was already inside the gates. The wedding dress was a masterpiece of suffocating elegance, woven from miles of imported French silk and Alençon lace, designed to project an image of fragile, unbroken purity. It was incredibly heavy, the boned bodice acting as a literal cage against Clara's ribs, restricting her lung capacity to shallow, measured sips of air. She stood perfectly still on a circular velvet pedestal in the center of Evelyn's grand drawing room, staring blankly into a massive antique mirror. 3 seamstresses fluttered around her ankles like anxious moths, pinning the sweeping train into absolute perfection. Evelyn stood in the corner of the room, sipping a mimosa, her eyes scanning Clara's reflection with the cold, critical satisfaction of an auctioneer sussing a prized thoroughbred just before the hammer fell. Clara did not see the silk, nor the lace, nor the delicate diamond tiara resting heavily in her dark hair. She saw the subtle, imperceptible rounding of her lower stomach beneath the layers of crinoline. She saw the phantom bruises of the freezing river still lingering on her skin. She saw the face of a woman who had systematically buried her empathy in a shallow grave, replacing it with a cold, biological imperative to survive and to slaughter. The transformation was complete. The advocate who had believed in the sanctity of the law had died on a bathroom floor 4 weeks ago. The woman staring back in the mirror was a vessel of calculated ruin, operating with the terrifying, icy precision of a syndicate queen. "You actually look presentable," Clara, Evelyn remarked, setting her crystal champagne flute down on a side table. Arthur managed to spin the narrative flawlessly. "The press is calling this the triumph of the human spirit. You survived the clutches of Julian Thorne. And now Senator Vance is providing you with the fairy tale ending you so desperately need. When you walk down that aisle today, you will smile. You will look at Richard with adoration. If you drop this facade for a single second, the executions begin before the reception even starts." "I understand perfectly, Evelyn," Clara replied. Her voice was a smooth, frictionless murmur, devoid of any emotional cadence. It was the voice of a ghost. What Evelyn did not know, what no one in this heavily guarded fortress could possibly comprehend, was the lethal secret currently resting flat against the inside of Clara's right thigh. Secured beneath the layers of silk and tulle by a tactical garter belt she had fashioned from torn bedsheets, it was a high-capacity, medical-grade syringe, fully loaded with a lethal, concentrated dose of rapid-acting insulin. Securing the weapon had been a masterstroke of psychological manipulation. 2 weeks prior, Clara had begun feigning severe, debilitating panic attacks, deliberately hyperventilating until she lost consciousness. The corrupt estate doctor, irritated by the constant interruptions to his schedule, had carelessly left his medical bag unattended in her suite for exactly 90 seconds, while he stepped into the hallway to complain to Pendleton's guards. 90 seconds was all Clara needed to extract the syringe and 2 vials of insulin meant for Evelyn's aging, diabetic spaniel in a healthy adult. A massive, unmitigated injection of concentrated insulin would cause immediate, catastrophic hypoglycemic shock. The brain would be instantly starved of glucose, resulting in violent convulsions, coma, and within minutes, irreversible brain death. It was silent, it was immediate, and in the chaos of a crowded cathedral, it would look exactly like a sudden, tragic cardiac event. She was going to kill Richard Vance at the altar. She was going to plunge the needle directly into his carotid artery the moment he leaned in to kiss the bride. And when Pendleton rushed forward in the ensuing panic, she would take his gun. She had played the entire scenario out in her mind 10,000 times. A violent, bloody choreography that kept her tethered to sanity. While Clara stood in the drawing room, allowing herself to be laced into a white cage. The shadows of the city were beginning to bleed. Julian Thorne was not dead. The sniper's bullet had struck him squarely in the chest, but the icy, violent current of the river had inadvertently saved his life. The freezing temperature had instantly constricted his blood vessels, severely slowing the catastrophic hemorrhage as the water dragged him miles downstream. He had washed ashore on a jagged embankment in the desolate, industrial sector of the shipping ports, his heart barely beating, his lungs filled with black water. He would have died there in the mud, had his fractured syndicate not possessed failsafes built for exactly this kind of apocalyptic scenario. A rogue, deeply embedded port worker loyal to the Thorne syndicate had found him, initiating a black box medical extraction protocol. Julian had been smuggled out of the country in the hull of a freighter, transported to a subterranean, black market surgical bunker in Montreal. He had spent the last 2 months trapped in a hellscape of physical agony. The bullet had shattered his ribs and missed his heart by a fraction of a millimeter, collapsing his left lung. The surgeries were brutal, performed without adequate anesthesia to keep his battered nervous system from crashing. But physical pain was a language Julian had spoken fluently since childhood. What kept him awake? What fueled the terrifying, superhuman velocity of his recovery? Was the image of Clara standing in the freezing rain with a laser sight on her chest. He had taken the bullet for her, but he knew Pendleton would not stop. He knew they would trap her. Every excruciating breath he drew, every agonizing step of his physical therapy, was driven by a pure, unadulterated, world-ending rage. He did not recover to reclaim his empire. He recovered to reclaim his equal. Now, on the morning of the wedding, the ghost had returned to the city. Julian stood on the rooftop of a Gothic stone building directly across from the Basilica of St. Jude, the grand, imposing cathedral where the ceremony was scheduled to take place. He was dressed entirely in matte black tactical gear, a heavy Kevlar vest strapped securely over his healing chest. The brutal, jagged scar over his heart throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a physical reminder of the debt he was about to collect. The wind whipped through his dark hair, carrying the distant tolling of the cathedral bells. His gray eyes, usually carefully guarded, were now wide open and burning with absolute, lethal intent. He reached into the tactical pouch at his hip and withdrew a single, perfect black rose. Vance and Pendleton believed their security was impenetrable. They had established a 3-block perimeter around the cathedral, utilizing private military contractors disguised as valet attendants, ushers' staff, and rooftop snipers. They were preparing for a localized threat. They did not understand that they were about to be hit by a man who knew the architecture of their violence better than they did. Julian moved across the rooftop with terrifying, feline silence, approaching the ledge overlooking the cathedral's southern transept. A mercenary sniper was positioned there, lying prone on a tactical mat, his eye glued to the thermal scope of his rifle. Scanning the streets below, Julian did not draw his suppressed sidearm. He drew a combat knife, the steel blackened to prevent glare. He dropped from the higher ledge, landing directly behind the sniper with virtually no sound. Before the mercenary could even register the shift in air pressure, Julian clamped a heavy, gloved hand over the man's mouth, simultaneously driving the combat knife upward, sliding it flawlessly beneath the base of the skull and severing the brainstem. The mercenary went entirely limp, dying instantly without making a sound. Julian lowered the body gently to the stone roof, wiping the blade on the dead man's tactical vest. He reached into his pouch and dropped the black rose onto the sniper's lifeless chest. It was the 4th rose he had left in the past hour. He was systematically dismantling the outer perimeter, cutting the tripwires of Pendleton's fortress in absolute silence. He tapped the comms unit in his ear. "Status," he whispered, his voice a rasping, metallic shadow. "Outer perimeter is dark, boss," a voice crackled back. It was one of his surviving lieutenants, commanding a heavily armed strike team waiting in the subterranean utility tunnels beneath the cathedral streets. "The snipers are neutralized. The local police dispatch has been jammed, rerouting all emergency calls to a dead server. You have a 4-minute window before Pendleton's internal security realizes their overwatch has gone offline. Hold your positions in the catacombs. Nobody breaches the main doors until I am inside the nave," Julian commanded, his eyes locked on the massive stained glass windows of the cathedral. "If anyone touches her before I reach the altar, you burn the building to the ground." Julian holstered his knife and unslung the customized, short-barreled assault rifle strapped to his back. He checked the chamber, the metallic click echoing softly in the wind. He was not the broken, traumatized boy from the foster system anymore. He was not the restrained, cautious boss who relied on digital ledgers and legal loopholes. They had taken the woman who had finally taught him how to breathe without fear. They had tried to cage his equal. He was going to walk into the house of God and turn it into a slaughterhouse. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. The pews were packed with the city's elite corrupt judges, complicit politicians, and wealthy donors who had built their fortunes on the broken backs of the innocent. The air was thick with the scent of burning frankincense and thousands of imported white lilies. A cloying, heavy perfume that made Clara's stomach roll. She stood in the narthex. The massive wooden doors to the main sanctuary closed before her. The heavy veil obscured her vision, casting the world in a hazy, white distortion. Evelyn stood beside her, adjusting the train of the dress one final time. "Remember, Clara," Evelyn hissed, leaning in so close Clara could smell the champagne on her breath. "Smile, or your friends in the holding cells die." The massive pipe organ began to play, the deep, vibrating chords rattling the stone floor beneath Clara's feet. The heavy wooden doors slowly groaned open, revealing the cavernous, glittering expanse of the cathedral interior. At the far end of the impossibly long aisle, standing before the marble altar, was Senator Richard Vance. He was smiling, a smug, possessive leer that made Clara's blood turn to ice. Beside him stood Arthur Pendleton, looking proud and victorious, the mastermind presiding over his ultimate triumph. Clara began to walk. Her face was a mask of perfect, aristocratic composure, but internally, her heart was beating in time with the heavy, thundering chords of the organ. With every step she took down the scarlet carpet, she was not walking toward a marriage. She was walking toward an execution. Her right hand remained perfectly still by her side, but her fingers were subtly twitching, mentally mapping the distance to the slit in the silk skirts where the syringe was hidden. 10 yards, 5 yards. She locked eyes with Vance, letting him see the utter, terrifying emptiness in her gaze. He mistook it for submission. She reached the altar. The music swelled, then faded into a heavy, expectant silence. Vance reached out and grabbed her scarred hands. His palms were sweaty, his grip painfully tight, a deliberate assertion of physical dominance. Clara did not flinch. She allowed him to hold her, her mind calculating the exact angle required to drive the needle past his jawline and into his artery. The priest, an older man radiating oblivious sanctity, stepped forward to the microphone. Dearly beloved. His voice echoed through the massive stone-vaulted ceiling. We are gathered here today in the sight of God, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Clara's right hand twitched, her fingers slipping imperceptibly toward the folds of her silk skirt. She was ready. The lamb was about to bare its fangs. But outside, the ghost had finally arrived at the gates. The priest asked if anyone objected. The answer came in the form of shattered, stained glass and a man returning from the dead. If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together. The priest intoned, his voice echoing over the hushed, glittering congregation of the city's most corrupt elite. Let them speak now, or else hereafter hold their peace. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy with the suffocating weight of Pendleton's absolute victory. Senator Vance smirked, leaning in slightly, his hot, sour breath ghosting against Clara's veil. You're mine now, you little bitch, he whispered, a vile promise meant only for her ears. Julian Thorne is rotting at the bottom of the river, and nobody is coming to save you. Clara did not blink. She did not tremble. Her right hand slipped seamlessly through the hidden slit in her massive silk skirt, her fingers wrapping around the cold, rigid plastic of the loaded insulin syringe strapped to her thigh. She disengaged the safety cap with a flick of her thumb. She didn't need anyone to save her. She was going to plunge the needle into Vance's neck the second the priest asked for the rings. But Clara never got the chance to raise her hand. The objection did not come as a voice from the pews. It came as a catastrophic, localized earthquake that tore the very fabric of the cathedral apart. 4 highly concentrated, shaped C4 breaching charges detonated simultaneously against the massive, reinforced oak doors at the rear of the nave. The explosion was deafening. A concussive shockwave of pure kinetic energy that violently blew the doors entirely off their massive iron hinges. The heavy wooden slabs flew inward like splintered matchsticks, crashing down upon the rear pews and instantly obliterating the intricate, 2-story stained glass web above the entrance. Thousands of shards of vividly colored glass rained down upon the congregation like a torrential downpour of jagged, glittering diamonds. The cathedral instantly erupted into sheer, apocalyptic pandemonium. The elite attendees, seconds ago sitting in arrogant safety, began screaming hysterically, diving beneath the wooden pews, covering their heads as the air filled with blinding white smoke, pulverized stone, and the deafening ringing of the blast. At the altar, Vance jumped backward, dropping Clara's hands as if they had caught fire. Pendleton stumbled, drawing a concealed sidearm from beneath his tailored jacket, his face draining of all color as he stared down the center aisle. Through the swirling, impenetrable cloud of white smoke and raining glass, a silhouette emerged. He walked with the slow, terrifying, inevitable rhythm of a reaper who had come to collect a massive debt. As the smoke began to clear, the silhouette solidified into the towering, broad-shouldered form of Julian Thorne. He was not wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing matte black tactical gear, his chest heavily armored. A customized assault rifle gripped tightly in his scarred hands. His dark hair was swept back by the concussive wind, and his striking, gray eyes were fixed with a lethal, terrifying intensity directly upon the altar. He did not look at the screaming congregation. He did not look at the armed mercenaries recovering from the blast. He looked only at Clara. Clara's breath vanished from her lungs. The syringe in her hand was entirely forgotten. She stared down the long expanse of the scarlet carpet, her heart slamming against her ribs with such violent force it threatened to crack her sternum. The crushing, agonizing grief that had suffocated her for 2 months evaporated in a single, blinding millisecond. He was alive. The man she loved, the father of the child secretly growing inside her, had crawled out of the abyss, clawed his way back from the dead, and walked into a fortress of his enemies just to look her in the eyes. Julian's strike team poured in through the breached entrance behind him, instantly fanning out. The cathedral morphed from a house of worship into a chaotic, brutal war zone. The deafening staccato of automatic gunfire erupted as Julian's men engaged Pendleton's private security detail positioned in the upper balconies and along the transepts. Bullets chewed through the ancient stone pillars, sending chips of marble flying into the air. Julian did not run, but his pace accelerated, closing the distance down the center aisle with terrifying, predatory focus. He raised his rifle, firing short, controlled, devastatingly accurate bursts. 2 of Vance's heavily armed guards stepped out from behind the choir stalls, raising their weapons. Julian dropped them both before they could even pull their triggers, never breaking his stride, his eyes never leaving Clara. At the altar, absolute panic seized Richard Vance. The sadistic arrogance that had defined him melted into raw, pathetic terror. He realized he was standing in the open, completely exposed to a man who had literally returned from the dead to slaughter him. Vance lunged toward Clara. He grabbed her violently by the throat, hauling her backward, using her as a human shield. He pressed the barrel of a silver, snub-nosed revolver directly against her temple, his arm shaking violently. "Stop," Vance screamed, his voice cracking hysterically over the din of the gunfire. "Drop the gun, Thorne, drop it. Or I blow her fucking brains out right here." The cathedral seemed to hold its breath. The gunfire around them momentarily ceased as Julian's men held their fire, waiting for their commander's order. Julian stopped exactly 10 yards from the base of the altar. The gray eyes that had been burning with lethal intent suddenly went agonizingly still. The sight of the gun pressed to Clara's head paralyzed him. The absolute, unmitigated terror of losing her, the very trauma that had driven him across the freezing river and through months of agonizing surgery froze the blood in his veins. He lowered his rifle slightly, his jaw locked so tight the muscles threatened to snap. He had survived death, but he could not survive watching her die. "Let her go, Richard," Julian commanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that carried over the chaos, echoing with absolute, lethal certainty. "Let her walk down these steps, and I promise you, I will make your death quick. If you pull that trigger, I will keep you alive for a month, and I will dissect you piece by piece." "Shut up. Drop the gun," Vance shrieked, pressing the barrel harder against Clara's temple, hauling her backward toward the sacristy door. Pendleton, standing a few feet away, realized the tactical advantage. He raised his own weapon, aiming it squarely at Julian's unprotected chest. "You should have stayed in the river, Julian. It's over." Julian looked at Clara. He saw the heavy white veil, the suffocating silk dress, the cruel grip Vance had on her throat. But as their eyes met across the marble steps, Julian realized he was not looking at a terrified hostage. He was looking at his equal. Clara's eyes were not wide with panic. They were burning with absolute, chilling obsidian fire. She looked at Julian, communicating a silent, Profound command forged in the subterranean war room of his estate. Forged in the moments as they'd spent dismantling corrupt empires side by side. I am not a victim. Her eyes said, I am the law. Clara did not scream. She did not struggle against Vance's grip to break free. Instead, she weaponized the absolute stillness he mistook for submission. With blinding, lethal speed, Clara raised her right hand from the folds of her silk skirt. She drove the medical-grade syringe backward with every ounce of physical strength she possessed, plunging the thick, steel needle deeply and flawlessly into the exposed, pulsing flesh of Richard Vance's neck, directly hitting the carotid artery. She slammed the plunger down, injecting the entire, massive, concentrated dose of rapid-acting insulin directly into his bloodstream in a fraction of a second. Vance gasped, a wet, choking sound of sheer shock. The silver revolver dropped from his trembling hand, clattering loudly against the marble altar steps. He released Clara's throat, his hands into his neck as his eyes widened in sudden, absolute biological terror. The massive overdose of insulin hit his brain like a freight train, instantly stripping all glucose from his nervous system. Vance stumbled backward, his knees buckling. He began to convulse violently, his body seizing as catastrophic hypoglycemic shock short-circuited his brain. He crashed heavily onto the marble floor, his eyes rolling back into his head, foaming at the mouth as he rapidly descended into an irreversible, terminal coma. Clara ripped off the heavy, suffocating white veil, tossing it onto the marble floor. She stood over Vance's convulsing body, her chest heaving, the empty syringe gripped tightly in her scarred hand. Looking like an avenging angel of death clad in white silk, Pendleton stared in absolute, stunned horror at the senator seizing on the floor. His brilliant, impenetrable plan had just been annihilated not by the mob boss, but by the woman he had underestimated, the woman he had tried to cage. The momentary distraction was all Julian needed. Before Pendleton could redirect his aim, Julian brought his rifle up and fired a single, precise shot. The bullet struck Pendleton's right shoulder, shattering the joint and spinning the corrupt district attorney violently to the floor. His gun skittered away across the polished marble. The altar was secured. The heavy, deafening roar of the firefight continued in the outer halls as Julian's men mopped up the remaining mercenaries. But the epicenter of the storm had suddenly gone dead silent. Julian dropped his rifle so it hung from its tactical sling. He sprinted up the marble steps, taking them two at a time, ignoring the agonizing, burning pain in his recovering chest. Clara dropped the syringe. She didn't wait for him to reach her. She practically threw herself down the remaining steps, colliding with his massive, armored chest. Julian caught her, his powerful arms wrapping around her with a fierce, desperate, bone-crushing strength. He buried his face in her dark hair, inhaling the scent of her. Pulling her so tightly against him, it was as if he was trying to fuse their bodies together, to ensure she could never be ripped away from him again. A raw, shuddering sound escaped his chest. Half sub, half law, the sound of a man who had touched the bottom of hell and had finally found the sun. You're alive, Clara wept, her hands frantically gripping the heavy Kevlar vest covering his chest, her fingers tracing the rigid plates, needing tactile proof that he was real, that he wasn't a phantom conjured by her grief. I saw you go under. Julian, I saw you go under. I'm here, Clara. I'm right here, Julian rasped, pulling back just enough to frame her face with his large, scarred hands. His gray eyes were bright with unshed tears, analyzing every inch of her face, checking for injuries. I promised you, Clara. I told you I would never let anyone cage you. I had to come back. I couldn't leave you in the dark. He looked down at Vance, whose violent convulsions were slowing into the shallow, ragged breaths of impending death. Then he looked at the empty syringe resting on the marble floor. Julian's eyes snapped back to Clara, a profound, breathtaking awe washing over his hardened features. He had come to tear the cathedral apart to save her, but she had saved herself. She had executed the architect of her torment with a cold, flawless precision that rivaled the most seasoned syndicate assassin. "You didn't need me to save you," Julian whispered, a fierce radiating pride illuminating his face. "You took him down yourself." Clara reached up, her scarred hands resting over his, her dark eyes shining with absolute, unwavering love and equal ferocity. "Equality means fighting the dark together, Julian. I am not a pawn. I am your partner." Julian leaned down and kissed her. It was not the gentle, hesitant kiss of their first night. It was a violent, desperate, claiming kiss. A collision of two surviving souls amidst the smoke and the shattered glass. It tasted of ash, tears, and absolute, undeniable victory. A groan interrupted them. Arthur Pendleton was attempting to drag his bleeding body across the marble floor. Trying to reach the revolver Vance had dropped. Julian broke the kiss, his expression instantly reverting to the icy, lethal syndicate boss. He reached to draw his sidearm, fully intending to put a bullet between Pendleton's eyes and end the corruption permanently. "No, Julian. Wait," Clara said. She placed a hand on his arm. Lowering his weapon, she stepped away from Julian, her heavy silk dress trailing through the dust and shattered stained glass. She walked over to Pendleton, standing over the man who had ordered the burning of her shelter, who had manipulated her life, who had nearly killed the man she loved. Pendleton looked up at her, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his arrogant facade finally shattered by raw, pathetic fear. "Clara, please," he choked out, his eyes darting to Julian, terrified of the executioner. Clara looked down at him with absolute, clinical detachment. "I told you, Arthur, I am not relying on a mobster to save me. I stand beside him." Clara reached down to the belt of a dead mercenary lying near the altar steps. She unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. She walked back to Pendleton, drove her knee hard into his uninjured shoulder to pin him to the floor, and violently wrenched his good arm behind his back. She locked the steel cuffs securely around his wrists, tightening them until they bit into his skin. "Julian's syndicate doesn't need to kill you, Arthur," Clara said, her voice echoing coldly through the ruined cathedral. "Because before they took my phone, I managed to bypass your firewall, every unredacted ledger, every offshore account. And the complete manifesto of your racketeering operation was successfully transmitted to a ghost server that broadcasted it to every major investigative journalism outlet in the country. The FBI might be on your payroll, but the press isn't." Pendleton's eyes widened in absolute apocalyptic horror. Death was a quick release. What Clara had just engineered was total, systematic, public annihilation. He would spend the rest of his miserable life in a federal penitentiary, stripped of his power, his wealth, and his legacy. Clara stood up, walking back to Julian. She didn't look back at the broken men on the floor. Julian stared at her. The woman in the ruined wedding dress, who had just dismantled a corrupt political empire without firing a single bullet. He realized, with absolute certainty, that he did not just love her. He revered her. "It's over, Julian," Clara said, reaching out to take his hand, her fingers laced through his. "Strong and steady. The empire is broken. Let's go home." Julian gripped her hand, pulling her tight against his side. As they turned and walked down the center aisle, stepping over the shattered stained glass and the ruins of the corrupt elite, Clara finally allowed the mask to fall. She rested her free hand lightly against her lower stomach, a secret smile touching her lips. The nightmare was over. The ghost had returned. The monsters were dead. And they were finally free to build a new world for the life growing silently in the dark. The heavy oak doors of the Basilica of St. Jude had been blown into splintered ruins, leaving a gaping, jagged maw that spilled the thick white smoke of the cathedral out into the cold, rain-swept afternoon. Clara and Julian walked through the shattered threshold, their hands locked together in an unbreakable grip. Behind them, the screams and the chaos of the city's corrupt elite echoed in the cavernous sanctuary, trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The distant, overlapping wails of police sirens were rapidly approaching, cutting through the heavy gray air, but Clara felt absolutely no fear. The sirens were not coming for her. They were coming for the broken, bleeding monsters she had left handcuffed to the marble floor. Julian's armored SUV was idling aggressively at the base of the cathedral's stone steps, surrounded by a tight, heavily armed perimeter of his surviving syndicate loyalists. As Julian led Clara down the stairs, the cold wind whipping her ruined silk wedding dress around her legs, the rear door of the SUV swung open. Clara stopped dead in her tracks, a sharp gasp tearing from her throat. Sitting in the driver's seat, his face a patchwork of dark purple bruises and a split lip, was Marcus. The towering head of security gave her a grim, exhausted nod. In the back seat, wrapped in a shock blanket, Maria was weeping softly, holding on to Dr. Eris, whose arm was tightly bandaged but functional. You got them. Clara breathed, turning to look at Julian, her dark eyes swimming with fresh, overwhelming tears. Pendleton had told her Marcus was being executed. He had used their lives to break her, but he had fundamentally underestimated the man he was warring against. Did you really think I would crash a wedding without securing my family first? Julian said softly, his gray eyes softening as he looked at her. My strike teams hit Pendleton's off-the-books holding facility 10 minutes before I blew the doors of the cathedral. No one gets left behind, Clara. Not ever again. Clara threw herself forward, leaning into the SUV to tightly embrace Maria, who sobbed into Clara's shoulder. A profound release of the terror they had all endured. When Clara finally pulled back and climbed into the passenger cabin, Julian slid in right beside her, the heavy armored doors slamming shut and instantly sealing out the noise of the approaching police convoy. Get us out of here. Marcus, Julian commanded, his voice tight. Take us to the glass house. We disappear for 48 hours while the media detonates Pendleton's career. Marcus threw the heavy vehicle into gear. Accelerating away from the cathedral, just the first wave of police cruisers turned onto the avenue, their lights flashing uselessly in the rearview mirror. They were too late. The king and queen of the underworld had already vanished back into the shadows. The ride to the safe house, a spectacular, highly secure architectural marvel of reinforced glass and steel suspended over the edge of the city's northern cliffs, was a blur of adrenaline and exhaustion. Clara sat completely pressed against Julian's side, her head resting on his armored shoulder. She could feel the heavy, rapid thumping of his heart beneath the Kevlar plates. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Every rhythmic beat was a defiant victory over the river that had tried to claim him. When they arrived at the glass house, the adrenaline that had kept Julian moving with lethal, superhuman precision finally began to crash. As they stepped out of the SUV and walked into the sprawling, minimalist living room overlooking the churning ocean, Julian stumbled. A harsh, agonizing grunt escaped his lips, and his hand flew to the center of his chest. Julian, Clara cried out, instantly wrapping her arms around his waist to support his massive frame. Dr. Eris was there in a second, his professional demeanor overriding his injuries. Get him to the sofa. Clara, now. He shouldn't even be walking. He discharged himself from a subterranean trauma ward in Montreal 5 days early to orchestrate this raid. They managed to guide Julian to the deep leather sofa. He sat down heavily, his face suddenly drained of all color, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Clara knelt on the floor in front of him, her hands frantically working the heavy Velcro straps and steel buckles of his tactical vest. You reckless, beautiful idiot, Clara whispered, her voice cracking as tears spilled down her cheeks. She peeled the heavy Kevlar away, revealing the black tactical shirt beneath. It was soaked in fresh, warm blood. The violent physical exertion of the cathedral raid had torn open the massive, healing surgical incisions across his chest. I'm fine, Clara, Julian rasped, reaching out to gently wipe a tear from her cheek with his thumb. It's just torn stitches. The bullet didn't hit anything vital. Accept my pride when you managed to take down a United States senator with a sewing needle before I could fire a shot. Clara let out a wet, shuddering laugh, grabbing his hand and pressing it tightly against her lips. Dr. Eris worked quickly, cutting away the ruined shirt and applying a heavy dose of localized anesthetic before swiftly resuturing the jagged, horrific wound that ran across Julian's pectoral muscle. Clara did not look away. She watched the needle piece his skin, memorizing the devastating physical toll he had paid to protect her. He bore the scars of a martyr, a man who had offered his flesh to the wolves so she could remain in the light. Once the wound was cleaned, tightly bound in fresh white gauze, and Julian was given a heavy dose of intravenous antibiotics, Dr. Eris and Marcus retreated to the lower levels of the safe house, leaving them entirely alone in the fading twilight. The silence in the glass house was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic crashing of the waves against the cliffs below. The room was bathed in the soft, bruised purples and deep blues of the evening sky. Clara was still kneeling on the floor. She looked down at herself, at the ruined, heavy silk wedding dress. It was stained with dust, soot, and the microscopic shards of the stained glass that had rained down upon them. It was a cage designed by her enemies, and she refused to wear it for a single second longer. She reached around to the back of the dress, her fingers finding the heavy silk laces. She pulled, untying the agonizingly tight corset. With a swift, fluid motion, she pushed the heavy fabric off her shoulders, letting the miles of imported silk and lace pool onto the hardwood floor around her knees like the discarded skin of a snake. She was left wearing nothing but a simple, white silk slip, her dark hair falling in a wild, unkempt cascade around her shoulders. Julian watched her, his gray eyes dark and burning with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. He reached out, his large, calloused hands resting gently on her bare shoulders, his thumbs tracing the line of her collarbone. "You are the most terrifying, magnificent creature I have ever seen," Julian whispered, his voice vibrating with absolute reverence. "When I saw you standing at that altar, I thought my heart was going to stop. I thought I had lost you. You will never lose me." "Julian," Clara said fiercely, moving up from the floor to sit on the edge of the sofa beside him. She reached up, her scarred hands gently framing his face. "I told you. We are equals. We fight the dark together. But there is something you need to know. Something I couldn't tell anyone. Not until I knew we were safe." Julian's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of concern passing through his eyes. "Clara, what is it? Did Vance hurt you? If he touched you, I swear to God I will march into the hospital and finish him myself." "No, he didn't touch me," Clara said quickly, shaking her head. She took a deep, stabilizing breath. The moment had finally arrived. The secret she had guarded with her life, the silent motivation that had transformed her into a weapon of absolute ruin, was ready to be brought into the light. She took Julian's right hand, unfolding his fingers. Slowly, deliberately, she guided his large, scarred hand down to her lower stomach, pressing his palm flat against the soft silk of her slip, directly over her womb. Julian went perfectly still. The fierce, lethal mob boss completely vanished, leaving behind a man suspended in absolute, breathless shock. He stared at her hand, pressing his against her stomach, his brilliant mind racing, analyzing the implication, doing the impossible arithmetic. He looked up at her face, his gray eyes wide, desperate for confirmation. "Clara," he breathed, his voice breaking entirely. "I found out 2 months ago," Clara whispered, tears overflowing, tracking hot and fast down her cheeks. "Right after the river, when I thought I had lost you forever, I found out that a piece of you is still with me, Julian. We're going to have a child." A violent shudder ripped through Julian's massive frame. He stared at her, the reality of her words crashing over him with the force of a tidal wave. He had spent his entire life believing he was a monster, a broken product of a broken system, destined to die violently and alone in the shadows. He had accepted that he would never have a family, that his bloodline would end in the gutters, where it had begun. And now, the woman who had taught him how to love without fear was looking at him with absolute, radiant joy, telling him he was going to be a father. Julian let out a raw, guttural sob. He slid off the edge of the sofa, dropping to his knees on the hardwood floor right in front of her. He wrapped his arms around her waist, burying his face directly against her stomach, weeping with a profound, earth-shattering release. A child, Julian choked out, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he pressed his cheek against the silk of her slip. Clara, my God, you carried this alone. You carried our child in that house, surrounded by those monsters. And you protected it. I protected our family, Clara said, weaving her fingers through his dark hair, holding him as he wept. I was never going to let them take this from us. I was going to burn the world down to keep this baby safe. Julian pulled back, looking up at her from his knees. His face was wet with tears, but his eyes were shining with a brilliant, blinding light. It was the look of a man who had finally been resurrected. I swear to you, Clara, Julian vowed, his voice fierce and unbroken, vibrating with absolute conviction. I swear on my life, on my soul. This child will never know the darkness we came from. They will never know fear. I will dismantle every violent piece of my empire. I will wash the blood from my hands. And I will build a world where you and this baby can walk in the sun. I am done being a king of the shadows. From this moment on, I am just yours. Clara leaned down, pressing her lips to his forehead, her heart swelling with an unconditional, overwhelming love. We build it together, Julian, a new empire. One built on healing, not blood. In the quiet sanctuary of the glass house, holding each other as the night finally claimed the sky, the war officially ended. The syndicate boss and the advocate had survived the apocalypse, and in the ashes of their enemies, they planted the seeds of a radiant, unbreakable future. A king doesn't need a captive. He needs a queen who can hold her own sword. And together, they rewrote the rules of the empire. 6 months later, the city was unrecognizable. The catastrophic data leak orchestrated by Clara on the day of the wedding had operated with the devastating efficiency of a nuclear strike. The unredacted ledgers, the offshore routing numbers, and the undeniable proof of systemic extortion had been broadcasted to every major investigative journalism outlet on the eastern seaboard. The resulting media firestorm had been unprecedented. The federal government, unable to ignore the overwhelming public outcry and the irrefutable forensic evidence, had been forced to act aggressively. Arthur Pendleton had not even made it to trial, stripped of his badge, his wealth, and his powerful allies. The disgraced district attorney had taken a plea deal, accepting 2 consecutive life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary in exchange for a transfer to solitary confinement, a desperate bid to avoid the general population, which was heavily populated by men he had wrongfully convicted. Senator Richard Vance was technically alive, but entirely absent. The massive, concentrated dose of rapid-acting insulin Clara had injected into his carotid artery had caused catastrophic, irreversible neurological damage. He existed in a persistent vegetative state, confined to a stark, heavily monitored room in a state-run long-term care facility, sustained by machines and feeding tubes. He was a prisoner in his own ruined mind, a chilling monument to the wrath of the woman he had tried to break. And Evelyn Sterling had been reduced to a phantom, implicated in the racketeering conspiracy and stripped of all her assets by federal asset forfeiture laws. She had been evicted from her sprawling country estate. Clara had made sure Evelyn avoided prison, not out of mercy, but out of a calculated, terrifying justice. Evelyn was forced to live in a cramped, mold-infested studio apartment in the city's most impoverished district. Surviving on a meager allowance Clara anonymously deposited into a heavily monitored account. Evelyn had worshipped wealth, status, and power above all else. Clara had ensured she would spend the rest of her miserable life drowning in obscurity and poverty, haunted by the knowledge that her survival was entirely dependent on the stepdaughter she had tried to sell. But the most profound transformation had occurred within the Thorn Syndicate itself. Julian had kept the vow he made on his knees in the glass house. He systematically dismantled the violent, illegal operations of his empire. He severed ties with the cartels, shut down the smuggling routes, and surrendered the black market territories to the authorities through anonymous, encrypted tips. He took the massive, untraceable wealth he had accumulated and aggressively laundered it through legitimate, philanthropic channels. The Thorn Syndicate ceased to be a criminal enterprise. It evolved into Thorn Global, a premier, highly ethical private security and real estate development firm. Julian retained his fiercely loyal core of operatives, men like Marcus and Dr. Eris, transitioning them into highly paid, legitimate executives and corporate security directors. He had washed the blood from his hands, trading the shadows for the boardroom, using his brilliant, tactical mind to outmaneuver corporate rivals instead of rival mob bosses. It was a crisp, brilliant autumn morning. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the salty breeze of the nearby ocean. Clara stood before a massive podium, the bright morning sun warming her face. She was 38 weeks pregnant, her stomach a beautiful, prominent curve beneath a tailored, emerald green maternity coat. The physical trauma of the past was entirely gone, replaced by a radiant, undeniable strength. Behind her stood a sprawling, state-of-the-art architectural masterpiece. It was a massive, campus-style complex, featuring secure housing units, an advanced medical clinic, a legal advocacy center, and a beautiful, expansive courtyard garden. Above the main entrance, cast in gleaming brushed steel, read the sign, "The Sterling Thorn Haven for Women and Children." It was her shelter, rebuilt, reimagined, and 10 times larger than the one Pendleton had burned to the ground. It was fully funded in perpetuity by the Thorn Global Charitable Foundation, heavily guarded by Marcus and a team of elite, female security professionals who understood the specific traumas of the women they were protecting. Clara looked out at the massive crowd gathered for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The press was there in droves, cameras flashing, reporters hanging on her every word. She was no longer the tragic victim of a kidnapping. She was a powerhouse, a renowned advocate, and the untouchable matriarch of a newly legitimate empire. For too long, the narrative of this city was dictated by men who believed that power was synonymous with control. Clara spoke into the microphone, her voice ringing clear, steady, and commanding over the hushed crowd. They believed that vulnerability was a weakness to be exploited, and that compassion was a flaw to be weaponized. They tried to burn our sanctuaries. They tried to tell us that we were pawns on their chessboards. She paused, her dark eyes scanning the crowd, projecting absolute, unwavering authority. But they underestimated the fundamental truth of survival. Clara continued, the passion in her voice bringing tears to the eyes of the women standing in the front rows. You cannot burn away the resilience of a woman who has decided she will no longer be a victim. This haven is not just a building. It is a declaration of war against the darkness. It is a promise that bodily autonomy is an absolute, undeniable human right. We are not currency. We are not collateral. We are the architects of our own destinies. And to any man who seeks to use violence to demand submission, let this building serve as a monument to your inevitable ruin. We will not hide. We will stand together, back to back, and we will fight. The crowd erupted into deafening, thunderous applause. Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant expression of pure victory. She stepped away from the podium, accepting a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors, and sliced cleanly through the thick red ribbon spanning the entrance. The haven was officially open. As the reporters surged forward and the staff began ushering the first families into the secure campus, Clara stepped back, retreating from the flashing cameras. Julian was waiting for her in the shadows of the courtyard colonnade. He looked devastatingly handsome in a perfectly tailored, charcoal gray suit, his dark hair catching the autumn light. The icy, terrifying aura of the mob boss was entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, profound peace that softened the harsh, scarred angles of his face. He watched her approach, his gray eyes shining with an absolute, reverent adoration that still managed to steal the breath from her lungs. That was a terrifyingly brilliant speech. Mrs. Thorne, Julian said, his voice a low, warm rumble as she stepped into his arms. I think half the politicians in the front row actually wet themselves when you looked at them. Clara laughed. A bright, joyous sound. Wrapping her arms around his neck and leaning into his solid, comforting warmth. They should be terrified. I meant every single word. Julian kissed her. A deep, lingering connection that grounded her instantly. He pulled back, his large hand moving down to gently, protectively cup her pregnant belly, as if on cue. The baby kicked forcefully against his palm. Julian's breath hitched, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder washing over his face. It was a reaction that never grew old. The terrifying syndicate boss completely undone by the tiny, invisible movements of his unborn daughter. She's restless, Julian murmured, leaning down to press a soft kiss against the emerald fabric of her coat. She's ready to conquer the world. Just like her mother. She's going to have a head start, Clara said softly, weaving her fingers into his hair. Because she's never going to know the monsters we had to fight. She's only to know the empire we built for her. 2 weeks later, in the quiet, highly secure maternity suite of the city's top hospital, Elara Sophia Thorne was born. She had a mop of thick, dark hair and her father's striking, piercing gray eyes. When the nurse finally cleaned her and placed her into Julian's massive, scarred arms, the man who had once ruled the underworld wept without an ounce of shame. He held his tiny, fragile daughter with a reverence that bordered on the holy, swearing silent, unbreakable vows into her soft hair. Clara watched them from the hospital bed, exhausted but radiating a profound, euphoric peace. The family was complete. The bloodline that was supposed to end in tragedy had been rewritten in the ink of unconditional love. Months later, on a warm summer evening, Clara stood on the expansive glass balcony of their new penthouse. The city sprawled out below them, a glittering carpet of lights stretching all the way to the dark, calm expanse of the ocean. The air was peaceful, carrying the faint, distant hum of a metropolis that was finally healing. Inside the penthouse, the soft, rhythmic lullaby of a grand piano drifted through the open sliding doors. Julian was sitting on the bench, holding infant Elara securely against his chest with one massive arm, while his other hand played a gentle, halting melody on the keys. Elara was cooing happily, her tiny fingers grasping at the fabric of his shirt. He was entirely, beautifully captivated by her. Clara leaned against the glass railing, a glass of sparkling water in her hand, watching the man she loved be the father he had always deserved to have. The scars on her hands rested lightly against the cool glass, shimmering faintly in the moonlight. She did not hide them anymore. They were not marks of victimhood. They were medals of survival. She thought about the long, violent road that had led her to this balcony. She thought about the fire, the casino, the betrayal, and the freezing river. She thought about the suffocating white dress and the syringe of insulin. Healing, Clara realized, wasn't about erasing the scars. It wasn't about pretending the fire never happened. Healing was about choosing who you allowed to touch those scars. It was about finding the person who looked at your broken pieces and didn't see a tragedy, but saw a warrior. They had not just survived the darkness. They had demanded absolute equality within it, true power. She finally understood. Wasn't about controlling others through fear or violence. True power was the terrifying, magnificent courage it took to choose your own destiny, to defend your bodily autonomy against a world that demanded submission, and to hold tightly to the hand of the person who fought right beside you in the trenches. Julian stopped playing the piano. He stood up, cradling Elara carefully, and walked out onto the balcony to join Clara. He wrapped his free arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side, burying his face in hers as they looked out over the glittering city together. "What are you thinking about?" Julian murmured, his voice a low, comforting vibration against her shoulder. Clara leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady, strong, unwavering heartbeat that had defied death to stay with her. She looked at their daughter, sleeping peacefully in the arms of the most dangerous, gentle man in the world. "I was just thinking." Clara smiled, turning her head to press a soft kiss to his jaw. that the monsters never stood a chance. As the echoes of the cathedral's shattered glass fade, and Clara and Julian step into the light of their new empire, we are left with a resonance that extends far beyond the boundaries of a traditional mafia romance. This story was never simply about the allure of the underworld or the thrill of a daring rescue. It is a profound, unflinching exploration of what it means to reclaim your autonomy in a world that constantly demands your submission. For our audience women who have navigated their own complex battles, who have carried the weight of immense responsibilities, and who have survived their own personal trials, this narrative serves as a powerful mirror reflecting your own indestructible resilience. At the very heart of this story is the fundamental redefinition of love and power. We are so often conditioned by fiction to accept toxic dynamics, to believe that a powerful man must be a controlling one, and that a woman's strength lies only in her ability to soften his edges or play the victim. Clara and Julian shatter this outdated mold. They teach us that true, enduring love is rooted in absolute equality and unwavering mutual respect. Julian's true strength is not his ability to wield violence, but his capacity to respect Clara's boundaries, to honor her intellect, and to recognize her as his true equal. This story imparts the vital lesson that a real partner does not cage you to keep you safe. They stand back to back with you, handing you a sword so you can fight your own battles together. Moreover, this narrative speaks deeply to the reality of trauma and the agonizing, beautiful process of healing. Both of our protagonists bear heavy, visible and invisible scars. Society frequently dictates that trauma makes us broken, that we must completely erase our pasts to be worthy of a peaceful future. But Clara and Julian show us a different, much more grounded truth. Healing is not the erasure of your pain. It is the courageous act of choosing who is worthy of seeing your scars. It teaches us that vulnerability is not a liability, it is the ultimate armor. Clara's profound compassion, even when manipulated and weaponized against her by corrupt men, remains her greatest asset. The story reminds us that retaining our empathy and our humanity in a cruel world is not a weakness. It is the bravest, most defiant choice a human being can make. Ultimately, the journey of Clara Sterling is a testament to the unyielding power of a woman who refuses to be a pawn in anyone else's game. When she was stripped of her resources, her allies, and her freedom, she did not wait for a knight in shining armor to deliver her from the dark. She became her own savior. She reminds every listener that no matter how insurmountable the odds, how corrupt the system, or how isolating the despair, you retain the ultimate power, the power to choose your own destiny, to protect what is yours, and to rewrite the rules of the game. You are the architect of your own empire, and you have the absolute right to demand a life where you are respected, cherished, and entirely free. This content was researched, developed, and manually edited by us to bring you meaning and valuable lessons.